The Japanese Navy loads Yamato with enough fuel for a one-way trip. That detail, practical, logistical, stripped of any ceremony, tells you almost everything you need to know about what April 1945 means for the Imperial Japanese Navy and the men sailing inside the largest battleship ever built. There is no fuel allocated for the return journey because the return journey is not part of the plan. The plan is to beach the ship on the shores of Okinawa if she survives long enough to reach them, use her 9 18-inch guns to destroy as much of the Allied invasion fleet as possible while she still floats, and then let her crew fight on shore until they cannot fight anymore. The operation is called Tengo. It is, by any strategic measure, an act of institutional suicide dressed in the language of decisive battle. Yamato deserves more than the ending she receives, not as a moral statement, but as an observation about the gap between what the ship represents as an engineering achievement and what the war allows her to actually do with it. She is commissioned in December 1941, displacing approximately 69,900 tons fully loaded, a figure so large that when I first encountered it in the technical specifications, I sat with it for a while trying to find a reference point. She is longer than 3 football fields. Her main turrets each weigh approximately 2,700 tons individually, more than many of the destroyers that escort her on her final mission. Her 9 18-inch guns fire shells weighing approximately 3,200 pounds apiece across distances exceeding 25 miles. Her belt armor reaches 16 inches at its thickest point. She is built to absorb punishment that would fracture any other surface vessel in any navy on Earth. And yet she spends most of the war in harbor. She is too valuable to risk, too expensive in fuel consumption to deploy for anything less than a decisive engagement that never quite arrives in the form her commanders expect. She carries an operational crew of roughly 2,700 men and burns approximately 6,000 tons of fuel oil on a full-power operation. Numbers that the Japanese Navy's eroding fuel supply makes routine deployment increasingly difficult to justify. By April 1945, the fuel situation in Japan has deteriorated to the point where the Navy draws on reserves collected from multiple sources just to fill Yamato's tanks with the roughly 4,000 tons required to reach Okinawa. Not the 6,000 tons her full operational range demands. 4,000 tons. One way. The men who sail with her know this. The junior officers who discuss the mission among themselves in the days before departure are not deceived about what the orders mean. Some of them write letters home that the surviving accounts describe as the kind of letters people write when they understand they are writing final things. The senior officers follow the orders because the institutional culture of the Imperial Japanese Navy in 1945 has no vocabulary for refusing an order framed as a sacrifice in the service of the emperor and the nation, regardless of what the tactical mathematics say about the outcome. The tactical mathematics are not ambiguous. American forces at Okinawa are supported by the largest concentration of carrier-based air power the Pacific War has produced. Task Force 58, Vice Admiral Mark Mitcher's fast carrier force, operates approximately 9 fleet and light carriers with a combined air group of over 1,000 aircraft. Yamato must cross open water to reach Okinawa without air cover because Japan's remaining carrier-capable pilots number in the dozens rather than the hundreds, and the aircraft that might have escorted the battleship are being conserved for kamikaze operations against the invasion fleet. A battleship crossing open ocean without air cover in April 1945, within range of 10 carriers, is not conducting a military operation in any meaningful offensive sense. She is sailing into a location where aircraft can find her. They find her within hours. American submarines track Yamato's departure from the Bungo Strait on April 6, 1945, and relay the course and speed to Pacific Fleet headquarters. Search aircraft locate the force the following morning. The first strike, 286 aircraft launched from Task Force 58, reaches Yamato at approximately 12:30 on April 7th, roughly 350 miles southwest of Kyushu. What follows across the next 2 hours is documented in extraordinary detail by both the American after-action reports and the accounts of the handful of Japanese survivors, and the two versions corroborate each other closely enough that the sequence of hits can be reconstructed with reasonable precision. The first torpedo hits begin arriving against Yamato's port side, the attackers deliberately concentrating on one side to maximize flooding and induce a list that compounds each subsequent hit. Bomb hits strike the upper works simultaneously, dismounting anti-aircraft guns and killing the crews working them. The ship's anti-aircraft battery, 152 25mm guns, and various larger weapons capable of filling the sky with metal, fires continuously, but cannot suppress coordinated attacks arriving from multiple directions simultaneously. Inside Yamato during those 2 hours, the experience of the crew is not the clean tactical narrative that the attack reports describe from altitude. The ship is a city made of steel, and it is dying, compartment by compartment. Damage control parties move through flooding corridors, attempting to seal bulkheads that the structural stress of multiple torpedo detonations has fractured. The list grows as water floods the portside spaces. Orders to counterfloat starboard tanks buy time, but cannot reverse the progressive flooding. The ship's movements slow. Her ability to maneuver, already limited by the list, erodes further with each hit. Yamato absorbs approximately 11 torpedo hits and 6 bomb hits before she goes. At approximately 14:23 on April 7, 1945, she rolls completely over and explodes. The explosion is visible from roughly 100 miles away. The magazine detonation, the same catastrophic ignition of the ship's own ammunition that destroys the Japanese carriers at Midway, sends a column of smoke approximately 6 kilometers into the sky. 2,498 men die with her. 276 survive. The ratio is not the result of insufficient lifeboats or inadequate survival equipment in some abstract sense. It is the result of a ship sinking so quickly after the magazine detonation, and the explosion being so violent that the ocean around her fills with wreckage and men at the same moment. The survivors who are pulled from the water by Japanese destroyers are in many cases men who happen to be on the exterior of the ship when the final explosion occurs, and are thrown clear rather than trapped inside. The escort that sailed with Yamato, 1 light cruiser and 8 destroyers, loses the cruiser Yahagi and 4 of the 8 destroyers across the same attack. The total Japanese dead from the entire Tengo force reaches approximately 3,700 men. American losses in the attack are 12 aircraft and approximately 32 airmen, a figure so lopsided against the Japanese loss that it sits in the record as a precise numerical expression of what air power does to surface warships operating without cover in 1945. Something that stays with me from reading the Japanese accounts of the Tengo operation, particularly the testimonies of the junior officers who survived and spoke in the post-war years about what they knew before sailing, is the specific quality of resignation that runs through those accounts. They are not accounts of men deceived into dying. They are accounts of men who understood what the orders meant, who sailed anyway because the institutional and cultural framework around them made the alternative something they genuinely could not contemplate, and who spent the hours crossing the East China Sea in whatever space their individual natures gave them between duty and terror, and the specific human sadness of being 22 years old on a ship with 4,000 tons of one-way fuel. If the night is quiet around you, and you are somewhere warm, and the details of this have accumulated into something heavier than you expected when you started listening, let the East China Sea in April sit in your mind for a moment. The water is blue and relatively calm. The largest battleship ever built is moving through it at approximately 22 knots, with a crew of nearly 3,000 men. Most of them aware on some level that the fuel in the tanks will not bring them home. Somewhere above the horizon, American aircraft are already airborne and already tracking. This is the entire history of the sinking of the Yamato, Japan's super battleship's suicide mission during the Second World War. There is a document sitting in the archives of the United States Strategic Bombing Survey, a post-war interrogation record typed on thin paper in which a senior officer of the Imperial Japanese Navy tries to explain to American officers who had just won the Pacific War why Japan built the largest battleship in history. And what strikes me about that explanation is not the defiance you might expect. It's the exhaustion. The sense of a man describing a decision made decades before he was involved in it. A decision baked into the institutional DNA of an entire navy long before the first steel plate was cut. The Yamato didn't begin in a shipyard. She began in a conference room in Washington in the winter of 1921 to 1922. Where the great naval powers of the world sat down to decide, with extraordinary bureaucratic calm, who was allowed to be how powerful. The Washington Naval Conference produced the Five-Power Treaty, signed on the 6th of February 1922, and it did something that no international agreement had quite done before in quite this way. It assigned national military identity by ratio. The United States and Great Britain each received a capital ship tonnage ratio of 5. Japan received 3. France and Italy received 1.67 each. Written down like that, it sounds almost civilized. An arms limitation agreement. A step toward peace. And it was, in some genuinely important ways, exactly that. But inside the Imperial Japanese Navy, the treaty landed differently. It landed as a formal, legally binding statement that Japan's navy was permitted to be 60% of the American fleet and 60% of the British fleet, and that this was the appropriate ratio, and that Japan should accept it. Naval officers who had spent careers studying sea power understood immediately what a ratio means in practice. It means you are designed to lose a war of attrition against either of those fleets. The Japanese delegation in Washington had not simply acquiesced. They had argued, pushed, demanded a higher ratio, and been denied. They accepted in the end, because the alternative, an unrestricted naval arms race against the combined industrial capacity of the United States and Great Britain, was clearly worse. But acceptance and satisfaction are very different things. The internal memoranda that survive from the IJN's post-conference analysis describe the ratio not as a compromise, but as a ceiling, a permanent structural constraint on Japanese naval ambition. And in the culture of the Imperial Japanese Navy, which prized individual ship quality and crew excellence as the counterweights to quantitative inferiority, that ceiling produced an almost immediate institutional response. If we cannot build more ships, we will build impossible ships. Article 19 of the Washington Treaty contained a provision that was supposed to make the ratio palatable. The United States and Britain agreed not to further fortify their Pacific Island possessions. No new bases in the Philippines, no expanded facilities in Hong Kong, no naval infrastructure in Guam or the Aleutians. In exchange, Japan accepted the 3/5 ceiling. It was a territorial concession traded for a numerical constraint. And for a while, through the 1920s, the arrangement held. The London Naval Conference of 1930 complicated matters. Japan pushed again for parity, or something closer to it, in submarine and cruiser tonnages. The push was partially successful and largely unsatisfying. By 1934, Japan had formally notified the other signatories that it would not renew the Washington Framework when it expired in 1936. The treaty era was over. The building era was about to begin. What the IJN's Naval Technical Bureau produced beginning in 1934 was not a ship design. It was an engineering answer to a political question. The question was, how do you defeat a quantitatively superior enemy fleet with a qualitatively superior ship? The answer they arrived at, after considering at least 8 preliminary design proposals, ranging from roughly 46,000 to 68,000 tons, was the Outranging battleship. The concept was straightforward in principle and ferociously complex in execution. If you could build a ship whose main guns could fire accurately beyond the range at which any existing enemy battleship's guns could reach her, you had solved the numbers problem. You wouldn't need 3 ships to their 5. You'd need 1 ship that could kill their ships before their shells arrived. The 46-centimeter Type 94 gun, with a maximum range of approximately 42,000 meters, was the answer. Everything else about the Yamato was built around that answer. Rear Admiral Keiji Fukuda is generally credited as the finalizing architect of the Yamato design, working within the Naval Technical Bureau through the mid-1930s. The design that emerged was extraordinary, and, in ways that would only become clear later, already obsolete by the time it was approved. The Outranging doctrine assumed a battleship duel, 2 battle lines exchanging fire at extreme range, with Yamato sitting safely outside the effective engagement envelope of any rival. That scenario required an enemy willing to fight the kind of war Yamato was built for. By the time Yamato was commissioned, in December of 1941, 9 days after Pearl Harbor, the United States was not fighting that war. Nobody was. The aircraft carrier had arrived. The doctrine the Yamato was designed to answer had already been replaced by a different question entirely, and the answer was now wrong. There's a footnote to this story that I think matters more than it usually gets credit for. The Washington Treaties Article 19, the non-fortification clause, was, by the 1930s, effectively a dead letter. American and British Pacific bases had not been expanded dramatically, but Japanese intelligence correctly assessed that the strategic geography of the Pacific meant that American industrial mobilization could overwhelm the 3 to 5 limitation within a few years of any serious war. The IJN knew at some level that the Outranging battleship doctrine was a solution to a problem that would dissolve under wartime conditions. They built Yamato anyway. The internal logic of an institution that has been told it is the lesser party doesn't always respond to strategic realism. Sometimes it responds to the need to demonstrate that it is serious, that it has not accepted its assigned inferiority quietly, that it has built something which, whatever else might happen, cannot be ignored. The full load displacement that Yamato achieved at commissioning was 71,659 long tons. The Washington Treaty's individual capital ship ceiling was 35,000 tons. Yamato was not a marginal breach of the treaty framework. She was almost exactly double its limit. This was not an accident or an oversight. It was a statement made in steel that the Imperial Japanese Navy had finished accepting its assigned place. Whether that statement was strategically coherent is a different question. The men who built the ship did not believe they were building a monument. They believed they were building a weapon that would win the decisive battle. The decisive battle never came in the form they imagined, but the ship was real, enormous, secret, and real. Construction began at Kure Naval Yard on the 4th of November 1937, behind 60-foot hemp and wood screens draped around dry dock number 4 to conceal the project from foreign intelligence. The workers were required to sign secrecy oaths. The ship's construction number, A140, appeared in all paperwork. Its name did not. The Japanese state was building, in conditions of extraordinary industrial secrecy, the physical embodiment of everything the Washington Conference had told Japan it was not permitted to aspire to. The irony of that is not subtle, and in 1937, with Japan already at war in China and the treaty framework already abandoned, there was no particular reason to hide the fact that Japan was building large warships. The secrecy wasn't primarily about the treaty. It was about the specific characteristics, the gun caliber, the armor thickness, the displacement, that would tell any competent naval analyst exactly what the ship was designed to do. The Yamato was, in the end, the most expensive answer to a diplomatic insult in naval history. Designed in response to the 5-to-3 ratio, built in secrecy, commissioned into a war that immediately rendered its doctrine irrelevant. That's the foundation, not the guns, not the armor, not the specifications. Those come next. The foundation is this: a nation told it was 60% as powerful as its rivals decided to build something that was 200% of the permitted limit, and justified it with a battle line doctrine that ceased to be strategically relevant the same week the ship was finished. The machine itself was magnificent. The thinking that produced it was already a ghost. Chapter 2: The blueprint that could not be copied. Put aside for a moment everything you know about what happened to the Yamato. Put aside the April of 1945, the aircraft, the explosions, the men in the water. Set it aside. Because before any of that is comprehensible, you need to spend some time with the ship as an engineering object, not as a symbol, not as a story, but as a machine. And the machine, examined on its own terms, is extraordinary in ways that a summary cannot convey. I'm going to take you through the technical architecture of the Yamato with the same deliberate patience the Naval Technical Bureau applied in designing her, because the only way to understand how she died is to understand precisely how she was built to survive. Start with the hull. Yamato's beam, her width, was 121 feet, measured at the waterline. That width was not accidental. It was the minimum necessary to provide adequate stability for the immense topside weight of 3 triple-turret main battery installations, and to accommodate the internal volume of 12 boilers and the machinery spaces required to move 71,000 tons at 27.5 knots. The hull form itself was unusual: a wide, relatively shallow entry at the bow, flaring to that enormous beam amidships, then tapering again at the stern, in a configuration that Japanese naval architects had refined specifically for stability in the sea conditions of the Western Pacific. The ship rode deep, a draft of approximately 34 feet, deep enough to require the modification of dry dock number 4 at Kure before she could even be built. Her silhouette, dominated by the distinctive pagoda-style superstructure, arose directly from the engineering requirement that fire control directors be elevated above the muzzle blast zone of the 46-centimeter guns below them. Form followed function, right up to the moment it followed symbolism instead. The guns. Let's be precise about the guns, because the numbers matter, and they're larger than most people realize. Each of the 3 main battery turrets weighed approximately 2,774 tons, heavier than most contemporary destroyers, the entire destroyer, hull and guns and crew together. Each turret housed 3 46-centimeter Type 94 guns. Each gun barrel weighed approximately 165 tons on its own. The shell it fired, an armor-piercing round, weighed 1,460 kilograms, roughly the same as a modern mid-sized car, and left the barrel at 780 meters per second. Maximum range: approximately 42,000 meters, or roughly 26 miles. The turret training rate was approximately 2.5 degrees per second, meaning a full 180-degree rotation took more than a minute. In a naval battle fought at the speeds of 1945, a minute of turret rotation was a geological interval. The armor scheme is where the real engineering sophistication lived, and where, as I'll argue, the design solved a problem that the war itself had already made irrelevant. Yamato's main belt armor measured 410 millimeters of Vickers hardened steel, inclined inward at 20 degrees from the vertical. That inclination was a deliberate choice. By tilting the belt inward, the designers increased the effective armor thickness against an incoming shell, which arrives at a relatively shallow angle, by approximately 6 to 7% through geometry alone, without adding any actual weight of steel. The turret faceplates reached 650 millimeters. To give that number some context, the armor on the face of Yamato's main turrets was thicker than the entire hull of some of the destroyers she was designed to fight alongside. The armored deck, designed to stop plunging shells arriving at steep angles from extreme range, was between 200 and 230 millimeters. The total weight of all armor installed in the Yamato exceeded 22,895 tons. This was not protection. This was a philosophical argument made of hardened steel. The anti-aircraft capability deserves special attention, partly because it was extraordinary, and partly because it was, in the end, almost completely useless. By April of 1945, after multiple refits, Yamato carried 12 dual 5-inch gun mounts, 54 triple 25mm mounts. That's 162 individual 25mm barrels, plus additional 13mm machine guns. That's a lot of anti-aircraft firepower on paper. But there's a specific problem with Japanese anti-aircraft doctrine and equipment that the numbers don't reveal. The 25mm gun, which formed the backbone of Yamato's close-range anti-aircraft defense, had a cyclic rate of fire of approximately 220 rounds per minute per barrel, which sounds impressive, and a practical rate, accounting for magazine changes and heat buildup, of closer to 100 rounds per minute. More critically, it lacked a reliable fire control director. Japanese anti-aircraft gunnery in 1945 was largely manually directed, relying on visual tracking of fast-moving aircraft by human operators, without the proximity fuse technology that had dramatically improved American anti-aircraft effectiveness. American pilots attacking the Yamato on the 7th of April, 1945, reported that Japanese anti-aircraft fire was visually terrifying. They also reported that it was wildly inaccurate. Then there's the Sanshikidan, the Type 3 anti-aircraft shell designed to be fired from the 46-centimeter main battery. This is the weapon I find most fascinating from a technical standpoint, because it represents an engineering idea that was simultaneously clever, desperate, and fundamentally mismatched to the operational environment it was designed for. A Sanshikidan round fired from the main battery weighed 1,360 kilograms, roughly the same as a standard armor-piercing shell, but instead of a hardened penetrating tip, it contained 2,500 incendiary pellets and rubber-burning tubes packed around a time fuse. On detonation, set at approximately 1,000 meters from the ship, the shell was supposed to erupt into a conical wall of fire and shrapnel, through which attacking aircraft would have to fly. The theoretical effect was a kind of giant incendiary shotgun round. American pilots who flew through these detonations described them as spectacular to watch and largely harmless to avoid. You could see the burst coming. You could see the approximate cone of effect. A minor course alteration was sufficient. The 46-centimeter gun, the largest naval gun ever fitted to a warship, became a fireworks display. The internal subdivision was the feature that gave the ship its theoretical survivability against underwater damage. 1,147 watertight compartments, each sealed independently, each designed to limit the spread of flooding from any single hit or penetration. This sounds impressive, and the underlying engineering was genuinely sophisticated. But the compartmentation system contained a structural paradox that would prove decisive. Correcting battle damage flooding on one side of the ship required deliberately flooding intact compartments on the opposite side. Counterflooding, in naval damage control terminology. This restored the ship's upright stability, but it meant absorbing twice the volume of water, once from enemy action, once from your own response to enemy action. Each time the damage control team corrected a list by counterflooding, the ship sat lower in the water, her freeboard reduced, her reserve buoyancy diminished. The system was designed to keep the ship upright through progressive flooding. What it couldn't do was keep the ship afloat indefinitely while the volume of water inside her hull continued to grow. The machinery plant produced 150,000 shaft horsepower through 12 canpon boilers and 4 sets of geared turbines, enough to drive 71,000 tons to 27.5 knots. Fuel capacity was approximately 6,300 tons of heavy oil, giving an operational range of roughly 7,200 nautical miles at 16 knots. At an economical cruising speed, fuel consumption was approximately 2,100 tons per day. At full power, the consumption rate was considerably higher. These numbers matter because they establish the physical parameters of the ship's existence. She was vast, she was fast for her size, and she drank fuel at a rate that would become a critical strategic problem as Japan's oil supply collapsed after 1943. Here is the thing about the armor scheme that the technical summary tends to obscure. The inward slope of the belt, the clever geometric trick that added effective protection without adding weight, also had a consequence below the waterline. The inward inclination directed the lower edge of the belt away from the hull plating, creating a zone at the turn of the bilge, the curved section where the ship's bottom meets its sides, where the protection transitioning from the belt to the underwater torpedo defense system was less effective than along the belt itself. Whether American torpedo attack coordinators in April of 1945 consciously identified this zone as a target is not clearly documented. What is documented is that concentrated torpedo attacks directed below and slightly outboard of the belt, which is what eventually accumulated against Yamato's port side, proved devastating. The geometry worked against her at the end. The design had been optimized against the threat of another battleship. No other battleship ever threatened her. The Yamato was, as an engineering artifact, genuinely without peer in her era. There was nothing like her. The armor was heavier, the guns were larger, the displacement was greater than anything afloat anywhere in the world. And the tragedy of the design, if tragedy is the right word for an engineering object, is that every specification was optimized against a threat that evaporated before the ship was commissioned. The outranging doctrine assumed a battle line engagement at 40,000 meters. The Pacific War was decided by carrier aircraft, submarines, and logistics. The Yamato had been designed to answer a question the war stopped asking in December of 1941. She was the perfect answer to the wrong question, and she was the most impressive wrong answer in the history of naval architecture. Chapter 3. The Secret the Ocean Kept. There is a particular kind of historical figure who almost never appears in documentary films about warships. Not the admirals, not the ship's captains, not even the ordinary sailors whose memoirs occasionally surface to put a human face on combat. I mean the workers, the men, and some women, who spent 4 years bending steel, operating cranes, laying electrical cables, and welding bulkheads in the enormous shadow of something they were formally forbidden to understand. At Kure Naval Yard between 1937 and 1941, approximately 10,000 civilian workers participated in the construction of the largest warship ever built, and most of them signed documents acknowledging that discussing what they were building with anyone outside the cleared workforce could be treated as an offense against the Japanese state. Some accounts describe the potential penalty as death. Whether the enforcement would have reached that extreme is uncertain. The warning was real enough that most workers appear to have taken it seriously. The secrecy apparatus at Kure was extraordinary. Dry dock number 4, the only facility in Japan large enough to accommodate Yamato's hull, was surrounded by 60-foot screens made of hemp cloth stretched over wooden frames. These screens enclosed the entire construction site, blocking sight lines from adjacent facilities, from the surrounding hills, from the water. Local residents in Kure knew the screens were there. The screens had become a local landmark, visible from much of the harbour area. What lay behind them was something most people in Kure could only speculate about. Workers entering the screened area were subject to search and identification checks. Those with access to sensitive areas of the construction, the turret assembly bays, the armour installation zones, operated on strict compartmentalization. A welder fitting plates to the forward magazine structure had no particular reason to know the caliber of the guns that would eventually sit above him, or the armour thickness of the belt he was installing, or the total displacement of the ship he was helping to build. The ship's construction number was A140. This designation appeared on all authorized paperwork, requisition forms, engineering drawings, payroll records, administrative logs. The word Yamato appeared nowhere in the administrative documentation until the ship approached commissioning. Workers who needed to discuss the project externally, dealing with steel suppliers, subcontractors, specialist equipment manufacturers, used the construction number throughout. The Japanese steel industry, producing the enormous quantities of Vickers hardened armor plate required for the project, handled materials designated for Naval Project A140 without necessarily understanding the full nature of the object they were supplying. The secrecy extended inward as well as outward. It was an architecture of distributed ignorance, each person knowing enough to do their specific job, and not significantly more. The keel-laying ceremony took place on the 4th of November, 1937, and followed the Shinto purification ritual traditional in Japanese warship construction. Cleared personnel attended. The name was not uttered. The administrative log for that day refers to the laying of the keel for Project A140. 3 years later, on the 8th of August 1940, the ship was floated for the first time, launched in the maritime sense, though not yet commissioned or finished. The launch was conducted at night, between tidal windows, to reduce the possibility of observation by any foreign intelligence asset that might have access to aerial photography or a position overlooking the harbour. Workers were required to remain on site for the 24 hours following the launch and were not permitted to contact family members during that period. The launch ceremony, by all available accounts, was attended only by cleared personnel and senior shipyard officials. 100 sake cups were distributed to the most senior shipyard workers present, a ritual gesture of honor for their labor. For most of those men, it was the last formal acknowledgement they would receive. What strikes me about the secrecy at Kure is not its effectiveness. American naval intelligence had noted the modification to dry dock number 4 and correctly inferred that Japan was building something larger than the treaty framework permitted, but its interior function. The secrecy was not primarily about concealing the project from foreign intelligence, because the existence of a large warship construction project at Kure was not, in fact, a secret to anyone who was paying attention. What the secrecy accomplished was something different. It prevented the workers themselves, and the broader Japanese civilian population, from having any means of assessing or discussing what the Navy was building, at what cost, or whether it represented a reasonable use of national resources. In a democratic society, such a project would generate public debate. In Japan in the 1930s, the secrecy arrangements ensured it generated nothing but compliance. The civilian workers at Kure were, for the most part, skilled tradesmen, shipwrights, electricians, boilermakers, machinists, who were doing the work of their trade in conditions that happened to be more restrictive than usual. Some of them, according to post-war oral histories collected by Japanese local historians in the 1980s and 90s, describe the experience as one of professional pride. They were building something that was clearly exceptional. The scale of the dry dock modification, the weight of the components they were handling, the precision tolerances required, all of this was evident to anyone working with the materials, even without access to the full specifications. Others describe a different experience. The persistent presence of military police in the shipyard, the awareness that careless conversation could have serious consequences, the sense of working under surveillance rather than working in pride. Both accounts are probably true, depending on the individual, the job, the year. The historical record doesn't let us choose between them. Construction involved a staggering quantity of materials. The total weight of armor plate installed in Yamato, Vickers hardened steel, manufactured domestically and at a quality standard that pushed Japanese steel production to its limits, exceeded 22,000 tons. The keel, frames, and hull plating added many thousands of tons more. The machinery installation required precision-machined components of extraordinary size: turbine casings, boiler drums, reduction gears capable of transmitting enormous mechanical forces without failure at high speed. All of this had to be sourced, transported to Kure, and fitted by workers operating under secrecy conditions. The logistics of building the largest ship in history, in secret, in a country whose industrial base was simultaneously being stretched by war in China, was itself an enormous organizational achievement. Nobody who was not cleared to know the full specifications of the project knew those specifications. 10,000 workers built a 71,000-ton warship, and most of them signed documents saying they hadn't. Commissioning came on the 16th of December, 1941, 9 days after Pearl Harbor. The ceremony was photographed. The photographs were immediately classified. The crew of approximately 2,400 men, many of whom were seeing a ship of this scale for the first time in their professional lives, boarded and took their stations. The name Yamato was now official, and it was now classified at a level that kept it out of Japanese public communication for months afterward. When Yamato appeared in Japanese newspapers, she was often referred to obliquely. Her name and characteristics still managed with extraordinary care even after commissioning, because the Naval Ministry judged that detailed public knowledge of the ship's specifications would give useful intelligence to American naval analysts. The workers who built the Yamato were never formally celebrated. They appear in no combat histories. Their names are not recorded on any memorial connected to the ship. The oral histories that exist were collected by local historians operating without institutional support, decades after the fact, interviewing men who were elderly and whose recollections carried all the natural distortions of extreme retrospection. Some of those men had died before anyone thought to ask them what they remembered. This is a common pattern in military history. The people whose labor makes the weapons possible are systematically excluded from the record that the weapons generate. The admirals who designed the mission, the captains who carried it out, the pilots who attacked, all of them appear in archives. The welder who sealed the forward magazine bulkhead does not. There is one detail from the launch ceremony in August of 1940, those 100 sake cups distributed to senior workers, that I keep returning to. The cups were, apparently, of a particular naval design. Post-war surveys of the Yamato wreck debris field at a depth of approximately 340 meters in the East China Sea have documented, among other items, what appear to be ceramic vessels from the officers' mess. China bearing the Imperial Navy chrysanthemum crest, largely intact after more than 80 years on the seabed. Different cups, different occasion, different people, but the same material persistence, the same ceramic stubbornness against time. And somewhere between the launch ceremony in 1940 and the debris field in 1945, approximately 3,000 men boarded a ship that 10,000 men had built in secret and went out into the East China Sea and did not come back. The workers who built her had no vote in that decision. They rarely do. Chapter 4. Yamamoto's Shadow. In the summer of 2025, a set of letters written by Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto during the early months of 1942 were released from private family archives and made public for the first time. Yamamoto was writing from his flagship. His flagship, at that point in the war, was the Yamato. He was the commander-in-chief of the combined fleet, the most powerful naval officer in Japan, operating from the largest and most heavily armed warship in the world. And if you read those letters with any knowledge of what Yamamoto had spent the previous decade arguing about naval strategy, the most remarkable thing about them is not the content. It's the address. The man who arguably understood carrier aviation better than anyone in the Imperial Japanese Navy spent the most consequential months of his command aboard a battleship he had never been convinced was the right answer. Yamamoto had entered the naval aviation world seriously in the 1920s. He commanded the Kasumigaura Naval Air Station in the mid-1920s and studied aviation in the United States, spending time observing American carrier operations and aircraft manufacturing capacity. By the early 1930s, his professional position was clear. Carrier aviation was the future of naval power, and Japan needed to invest in it aggressively. He was not alone in this view within the IJN. The carrier faction and the battleship faction had been fighting an institutional battle for years. But Yamamoto's advocacy was more pointed, more analytical, and more public than most. He understood the arithmetic. The United States could outbuild Japan in battleships, given time. The carrier offered a potential disruptive edge that numbers alone couldn't neutralize. Whether Yamamoto actively opposed the Yamato design during its approval process in the mid-1930s is genuinely uncertain. He was serving in the Naval Affairs Bureau during some of the relevant period, and some post-war Japanese naval memoirs suggest he raised doubts privately. The USSBS interrogation records of surviving IJN design officials don't mention his opposition. This is the kind of source conflict that turns up in serious archival work and doesn't resolve cleanly. Yamamoto's private views may have been skeptical. His institutional position may have required something more measured, and the documentary trail is thin enough that confident assertions on either side are probably overreaching the evidence. What is clear is that when he became commander-in-chief of the combined fleet in August of 1939, he inherited a fleet that was being built around the Yamato and her sister ship, the Musashi. He didn't design them. He just had to figure out what to do with them. The answer, for most of his tenure, was use the Yamato as a floating headquarters. The combined fleet staff moved aboard in the early months of 1942, filling the enormous flag accommodation spaces with planning charts, communication equipment, and the administrative machinery of Fleet Command. And there is something operationally appropriate about this, in a grim way. Yamato was perfectly suited to serve as a command center. She was large enough to accommodate a substantial staff without crowding. Her communications equipment, a sophisticated suite of transmitters, receivers, and direction-finding gear, was among the most capable afloat. She was fast enough to reposition as strategic needs shifted. She was, by any measure, an excellent floating headquarters. She was also the most powerful surface combatant in the world, sitting at anchor in the inland sea, while the war she was designed to fight moved in a direction nobody had planned for. The Battle of Midway, fought in early June of 1942, is the pivot point in this story. Yamamoto commanded the operation from the Yamato, positioned approximately 500 miles behind the carrier strike force, receiving radio reports as events developed. When the four fleet carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, Hiryu, were destroyed in the space of roughly 2 days, Yamamoto faced an immediate tactical decision. He had a surface force, including the Yamato, that theoretically outgunned anything the American Navy could bring to bear in a night surface action. For a brief period, there was genuine consideration of pressing on with a battleship engagement. Then the calculations caught up with the instinct. Without air cover, without confirmed enemy positions, With American submarines patrolling the approaches, the surface engagement was tactically impractical and strategically pointless. Yamamoto ordered retirement. The Yamato's guns, at Midway, fired nothing. The largest naval weapon in the world had observed the decisive naval battle of the Pacific War from 500 miles away and contributed nothing to it. Mitsuo Fuchida, who had led the air attack on Pearl Harbor and survived Midway as an observer, described Yamamoto's state in the days after the Midway disaster in terms that suggest something close to genuine anguish. A man who had planned the operation with care, who had argued for years that carrier aviation was the decisive arm, and who had watched those carriers destroyed in a matter of hours. The memoir accounts, Fuchida's among them, are themselves complicated sources, written after the war with various degrees of retrospective shaping. But the consistent picture is of a combined fleet commander who understood, after Midway, that Japan had lost the initiative in the Pacific and was unlikely to recover it. The Yamato, sitting in the inland sea or at anchorage at Truk, continued to consume fuel, maintain her crew, and represent the Navy's most visible symbol of power, while being operationally irrelevant to the war's actual trajectory. What I find genuinely interesting and somewhat underappreciated about the Yamamoto-Yamato relationship is how completely it inverts the usual logic of military symbolism. Yamamoto is associated in popular memory with carrier aviation, with the Pearl Harbor attack, with the great carrier battles of 1942. He is not associated with the Yamato, but the Yamato was his flagship for approximately 14 months. He lived aboard her, planned from her, read his reports in her flag spaces, watched the Pacific War begin its slow turn against Japan from within her steel walls. The ship that is culturally identified with everything he wasn't, the battleship doctrine he had spent a decade questioning, was his home for more than a year of the most consequential period of his career. In February of 1943, Yamamoto left Yamato for the last time to visit forward bases in the Solomon Islands area. He was conducting an inspection tour, the kind of morale-building visit that senior commanders make when the frontline situation is difficult and the troops need to see a flag officer. On the 18th of April, 1943, his transport aircraft was ambushed over Bougainville. The ambush was not a coincidence. American codebreakers had decrypted his detailed travel itinerary, transmitted in a Japanese naval code that had been broken, and 16 P-38 fighters had been dispatched specifically to intercept his flight. He was killed. Japan lost its most capable strategic naval mind to the same kind of signals intelligence operation that would, 2 years later, ensure that the Yamato's final mission was fully visible to American planners before she even sailed. The pattern runs through this entire story. After Yamamoto's death, the combined fleet flag was transferred off the Yamato. The ship's role as the center of strategic command ended. She became, in the inventory of the Imperial Japanese Navy, simply the largest and most expensive problem they didn't know how to solve. The Yamato had not fired her main battery in combat yet. She had been bombed once, lightly, by a submarine-launched aircraft in a different context, and had suffered minor damage. She had been present for the opening act of the Pacific War without contributing to it in any meaningful way. The institutional investment she represented, in steel, in design hours, in worker years at Kure, in fuel consumed at anchor, had produced a ship that was, by the middle of 1943, a magnificent problem rather than a solution. The decisive battle had not materialized. The carrier war was being decided by different ships and different weapons. The Yamato waited. The Battle of Leyte Gulf, in October of 1944, would finally put the Yamato into combat. That's a story that gets its own chapter. But what matters here, what belongs in this chapter about Yamamoto's shadow and the institutional trap the Yamato represented, is that by the time Yamamoto was killed in April of 1943, the operational logic for the Yamato's existence had already collapsed. She couldn't be used offensively without air cover she rarely had. She couldn't be risked in independent raiding because losing her would be a catastrophic morale blow. She couldn't be kept at anchor forever because she was consuming scarce fuel and occupying scarce dry dock time for periodic maintenance. The battleship that was supposed to solve the numbers problem had become a problem that nobody knew how to solve. Yamamoto had never entirely believed in the answer, and now he wasn't there to wrestle with it. Chapter 5. The Ledger That Condemned Her. There is a genre of historical document that doesn't appear in documentary films very often because it doesn't have a face, or a voice, or dramatic photographic potential. It's the supply manifest, the fuel allocation record, the logistics report filed in triplicate by an officer whose name nobody remembers, accounting for tonnages of oil, quantities of ammunition, and the specific mechanical capacities of ships that are about to be destroyed. I've spent time with the reconstructed versions of these records, drawn from post-war interrogations of IJN logistics officers by USSBS teams, from the operational histories of the combined fleet, from the fuel depot administration records that survived the war. And what they tell you about April of 1945 in Japan is something that the combat narratives tend to skip over. They tell you about a nation that had run out of the physical materials to continue the war it was still fighting, and was using arithmetic to decide how to spend what little remained. Japan's domestic oil production in 1944 was approximately 5.6 million barrels annually. The military's requirement, based on pre-war planning and operational doctrine, was closer to 33 million barrels per year. The gap between those two numbers, the enormous, unbridgeable gap, was supposed to be filled by imports from the Dutch East Indies, from Borneo, from the oil fields of the southern resource zone that the Pacific War had been launched, in significant part, to secure. And for a period, the imports came. But American submarine operations, aggressive, sustained, increasingly effective as torpedo reliability improved through 1943 and 1944, had destroyed the Japanese merchant tanker fleet with a thoroughness that the IJN's anti-submarine warfare capacity could not counter. By early 1945, the tanker routes that had been supplying Japan's military fuel needs had been effectively severed. The oil fields still existed. The oil could not get to Japan in sufficient quantities. The consequences were visible everywhere in the combined fleet's operations. Carriers were being kept in home waters, not because of tactical decisions, but because they literally didn't have fuel to conduct offensive operations. Destroyers were operating at reduced speeds to extend their fuel endurance. Training programs for pilots, already critically inadequate, were being curtailed further because aviation fuel was being prioritized for operational sorties over instruction. By the spring of 1945, the combined fleet's operational fuel reserve had fallen to a level that allowed perhaps 2 or 3 major operations, depending on scale. Every ton of oil used was a ton that couldn't be used for something else. Every sortie was a cost. And in this environment, the question of what to do with the Yamato, sitting at Tokuyama anchorage in the inland sea, consume roughly 85 to 120 tons of heavy oil per day, just to maintain auxiliary operations at rest, had acquired a specifically logistical dimension. The fuel allocation orders for Operation Tenichigo are, by the standards of naval administrative documents, a small masterpiece of institutional confusion. The original instruction from the Naval General Staff in Tokyo directed the fuel depot to supply enough oil for a one-way trip to Okinawa, approximately 2,500 tons for the Yamato. The rationale was straightforward. The mission was not expected to produce survivors, so fueling for a return journey was an unnecessary expense of irreplaceable resources. The local fuel depot officer, working within the constraints of what was actually available at Tokuyama, appears to have interpreted his instructions with a degree of practical latitude. The Yamato departed on the 6th of April, 1945, carrying approximately 4,000 metric tons of heavy oil. More than the one-way instruction, less than a full operational load. The surviving destroyers of the escort force received whatever heavy fuel oil could be scraped together, and at least some accounts, including one sourced to a Mainichi Shimbun report drawing on wartime records, suggest that destroyers made up the deficit in their fuel supply with a mixture that included vegetable-based oil, possibly including soybean oil, blended into their fuel systems. Let me be precise about what that means technically, because it matters. Japanese Kanpon-type boilers, as installed in the escort destroyers, operated on heavy fuel oil, mazout, that was preheated to between 80 and 100 degrees Celsius before injection into the burner assemblies. Vegetable oils have different viscosity profiles, different heating requirements, and different combustion characteristics than petroleum-based mazout. Blending them into a heavy fuel oil system wasn't completely unprecedented. The IJN had been running a formal program since 1944, testing alternative fuels as petroleum imports collapsed. And that program had produced blending protocols and tested viscosity specifications in controlled conditions. The soybean oil reportedly used on this sortie had been formally approved for mixed use in destroyer fuel systems under that program. It is, in other words, not improvisation. It is the product of meticulous professional engineering work applied to the problem of keeping a fleet operating when its fuel supply has been systematically destroyed. Japan's naval engineers were doing careful, competent work to solve a problem caused by their nation's catastrophic strategic position. The aircraft carrier situation is the hardest part of this logistical picture to convey without the numbers sounding abstract. By April of 1945, Japan still had carriers. The fleet carriers, Junyo, Ryuho, Katsuragi, Amagi, Kaio, some damaged, some operational, all theoretically capable of carrying aircraft, existed as physical objects in Japanese ports. The problem was not the ships. It was the people who were supposed to fly from them, and the fuel those aircraft required. The intensive kamikaze program, which had been absorbing the best available pilots since late 1944, had fundamentally altered the IJN's training pipeline. Aircraft that might have been used in conventional defensive operations were being committed to one-way attack missions. Aviation fuel was being prioritized accordingly. When the combined fleet's planning staff looked at what air cover they could promise the Yamato task force on the 7th of April 1945, the honest answer was 6 fighters at dawn, departing by 10 in the morning. That was it. 6 fighters for a 10-ship surface force attempting to cross approximately 500 nautical miles of sea that American carrier aircraft had turned into a killing ground. The figures for the Kikusui, floating chrysanthemum, kamikaze operations, provide a grim context. Kikusui No. 1, which launched on the 6th and 7th of April 1945, the same days as the Yamato sortie, committed approximately 355 aircraft to attack the American naval forces at Okinawa. Each kamikaze sortie required fuel, aviation gasoline, produced from a different source and processed differently from the heavy fuel oil the warships burned, but competing for the same constrained allocation of resources. The logistics staff was simultaneously managing fuel for kamikaze aircraft, for conventional defensive air operations over the home islands, for the Yamato task force, and for submarine operations. There was not enough of anything. The decisions being made in April of 1945 were not decisions about strategy. They were decisions about which ration scarcity to deploy in which direction. The question of whether the Yamato's crew was informed that their fuel supply was calculated for a one-way mission is genuinely contested in the primary sources. The NHHC analysis, drawing on multiple post-war interrogations, concludes that the ships were filled as fully as available stocks permitted, regardless of the one-way instruction from Tokyo. Captain Hara of the Yahagi, in his memoir published in 1961, states that officers aboard the Yahagi discussed fuel extensively before departure, and that most of them understood the mission as terminal, regardless of how much oil was in the tanks. Rear Admiral Morishita, the senior survivor of the Yamato herself, gave post-war testimony suggesting the fuel quantity was not the critical psychological variable, because no one in the task force's senior staff expected to survive long enough for return fuel to matter. 3 sources, 3 slightly different framings of the same fact. The mission was one way. The fuel records reflect this reality. The men knew it before they looked at the gauges. What the fuel ledgers really tell us, and this is the thing that stays with me, is that by April of 1945, Japan's military logistics had reached a state where a major surface operation was materially indistinguishable from a disposal operation. The Yamato was consuming fuel at anchor. The fuel depot at Tokuyama was not going to have that fuel available for much longer, as American air operations and supply disruption continued. Sending the ship to Okinawa used the fuel for a military purpose. Keeping her at anchor used it for nothing. Within the constrained arithmetic of a collapsing fuel supply, the sortie made a kind of terrible sense that had nothing to do with its tactical prospects. The ledger that condemned the Yamato to the East China Sea was not a battle order. It was an oil accounting document. Chapter 6. The Mutiny That Wasn't. On the afternoon of the 5th of April, 1945, the ship captains of the Japanese Surface Special Attack Force were assembled aboard the light cruiser Yahagi in Tokuyama anchorage. They had known for several days that something was coming. Orders had been issued. Fuel and ammunition had been loaded. 6 sailors and elderly crew members had been sent ashore. The 67 midshipmen of the Etajima Naval Academy, class number 74, recently assigned for what was supposed to be a combat familiarization posting, had been put ashore as well. Many of the midshipmen, reportedly, had begged to stay. They were sent off the ships anyway, which told anyone who was paying attention exactly what kind of operation this was going to be. Now the captains gathered in the Yahagi's wardroom, and the man sent from Tokyo to brief them, Vice Admiral Ryunosuke Kusaka, Chief of Staff of the Combined Fleet, explained the details of what would be called Operation 10 Ichigo, Heaven Number 1. The reaction was, by any accounting standard, as close to institutional mutiny as the Imperial Japanese Navy had experienced since the fleet faction disputes of the 1930s. The captains objected, unanimously. Not to the prospect of dying. That much seems clear from every account of the meeting. The culture they operated in had frameworks for sacrifice that were genuine and deeply held. What they objected to was the operational design of the mission, with a professional sharpness that was entirely coherent and, in retrospect, entirely correct. Attacking in daylight, without meaningful air cover, against a concentrated American carrier force that had been destroying Japanese naval assets for 3 years, without the element of surprise, without a realistic operational plan for the beaching of the Yamato that accounted for the certainty of air attack during the approach. The captain's professional judgment was unanimous. This force would not reach Okinawa. They were right. The alternative they proposed, and this detail tends to get lost in accounts that focus on the heroism or tragedy of the sortie itself, was not refusal. Nobody in that room was refusing to fight. What they argued for, with some force and some heat, was the option to conduct independent raiding operations against the American supply lines. Dispersed destroyer attacks. Small unit operations that might actually reach a target before being destroyed. The same kind of warfare that had made Japanese destroyer doctrine genuinely dangerous earlier in the war. The captains were, in other words, proposing a different kind of sacrifice, one that might accomplish something before it ended. That proposal was not accepted. The operational order from Admiral Toyota stood. Captain Tamechi Hara commanded the Yahagi, and his 1961 memoir, Japanese Destroyer Captain, is the most detailed surviving account of the meeting from the Japanese side. Hara was a professional sailor of the First Order. He was, as he frequently noted, the only Japanese destroyer captain present at the war's beginning who was still alive at its end. His assessment of the operation was expressed, memorably, in a single sentence that has become the most quoted line from any participant in the battle. He said the mission would be like throwing an egg against a rock. I want to sit with that sentence for a moment, because it's famous enough that it tends to get treated as a piece of rhetoric rather than a professional judgment. Hara wasn't being poetic, he was being precise. The egg was a surface force without air cover. The rock was the American carrier task force. The outcome of the collision was not in doubt. He was describing a physical certainty, not a metaphor. The meeting's turning point came when Vice Admiral Kusaka invoked the Emperor. The operational order, he explained, had been shaped by a question His Majesty had raised on the 29th of March during a briefing on plans for Japanese air operations in defense of Okinawa, asking what the Navy was doing. The senior IJN leadership had interpreted that question as an implicit criticism of the Navy's apparent inaction. And in the framework of the Imperial Japanese military, a question from the Emperor was not merely a question. It was something closer to a mandate. When Kusaka made clear that compliance with the operational order was, in this sense, compliance with an imperial expression of will, the room changed. Not immediately, not without further argument. The meeting was contentious throughout, by all accounts. But the direction of travel was now fixed. The professional objections remained. The objections simply no longer had the authority to matter. Here is where the history gets genuinely complicated, and I think it's important to say so directly, rather than smooth it over. A report published in the Asahi Shimbun in August of 2024, drawing on newly examined Imperial Palace documents, suggests that the date and nature of Hirohito's question have been misattributed in the established historical record. According to this reporting, what had been treated as the Emperor's March 29th question, the one that triggered the operational planning, may have been a genuine inquiry rather than an implied order, and the Naval General Staff's interpretation of it as a mandate for action may have been an institutional reading that the Emperor himself did not intend. As of early 2026, this revision has been reported, but not definitively confirmed or challenged by the broader scholarly community. If it holds up, if the primary documents support the interpretation, then the established causal chain for Operation Tenichigo requires revision at its most fundamental level. The Yamato may have been sent to its death partly because a group of senior naval officers misread a question from a man looking through wire-framed spectacles. That possibility has not been resolved. It should not be resolved prematurely. The captains were, at the close of the meeting, offered a formal option. They could decline to participate. The offer was real in the administrative sense. It was stated. It was on the record. It was not real in any practical sense that the men in that room would have recognized. Declining to participate in an operation sanctioned by imperial authority, in the culture of the Imperial Japanese Navy in April of 1945, was not a viable professional or personal choice. To refuse would be to stand apart from the sacrifice of every other officer and crew in the force. To refuse would be to imply that your life had value beyond the imperial will. The offer of refusal was a procedural formality that existed to make the record clean. Every captain understood this. Not one of them refused. What happened in the days between that meeting and the sortie on the 6th of April is documented in fragments from multiple survivor accounts. Crews were informed, in general terms, that the mission was a special attack, the word special carrying its understood meaning. Morale aboard the Yamato was described, in multiple post-war testimonies, as not very good. This is not surprising. Sailors talk. The departure of the sick, the elderly, the midshipmen, all of these were visible signals that the commanding officers weren't trying to hide the nature of the operation from the men who would carry it out. Some accounts describe quiet evenings of sake and conversation among men who had accepted the situation with a kind of settled calm. Others describe a ship whose lower decks were silent in ways that felt different from the usual silence before an operation. Both were probably true on different decks at different hours. I keep returning to the 67 midshipmen put ashore before departure. Many of them, reportedly, begged to remain. They were young men who had signed up to fight and were being told, in effect, that this particular fight wasn't worth their deaths. Or, more precisely, that their deaths were being conserved for a different occasion. The distinction the commanding staff was making was not about courage, it was about utility. Killing 67 not yet commissioned officers who had just arrived from the academy wasn't strategically necessary. Their training represented a national investment. They had futures that the Navy's planning still accounted for. The men of the Yamato and her escorts, most of them, did not have futures that anyone in the planning chain was calculating. That calculation, as much as any battle order or operational directive, is what the word special attack meant. The force sailed from Tokuyama on the afternoon of the 6th of April, 1945, at 1600 hours. The Yahagi led, followed by 8 destroyers in formation, with the Yamato bringing up the rear of the column. The afternoon was cool, approximately 50 degrees Fahrenheit, with the southeast wind at roughly 15 knots. Thick cloud cover overhead. The men on deck could see the coastline of the inland sea passing, and then the Bungo Strait opening before them, and then open water. The mountains of Kyushu visible astern in a haze, painted, as Lieutenant Yoshida described, in black and white. At some point, different for each man, depending on his position, his knowledge, his disposition, the shore disappeared behind them. Japan was behind them. What was ahead was known, in its outlines, to everyone who had been in that wardroom aboard the Yahagi. The ships moved at 20 knots through the thickening dark, and the American submarines that were already waiting to report their departure had begun transmitting, in clear, unencrypted language, naming the Yamato, giving her course and speed, to commanders who had known she was coming for 11 days. On the 26th of March, 1945, 12 days before the Yamato sailed from Tokuyama, a group of American cryptanalysts at Fleet Radio Unit Pacific, known in the abbreviated language of wartime intelligence as FRUPAC, finished processing a decrypted message from the Imperial Japanese Navy's combined fleet. The message was the execute order for Operation Ten Ichigo, Heaven Number 1, the operation that would send the Yamato to Okinawa. The analysts flagged it, summarized it, and passed it upward through the intelligence chain to Admiral Raymond Spruance, commander of the United States Fifth Fleet, who was at that moment planning the largest amphibious operation in the Pacific Theater. Spruance read the summary and understood, with the clarity that good intelligence provides, that the Japanese Navy was going to send what remained of its surface fleet on a one-way mission toward his invasion force. He also understood, having access to the decoded message, that this mission was going to happen before almost anyone on the Yamato itself had been told what they were doing. This is worth sitting with for a moment. The sequence of information flow in the days before the sortie runs in a direction that inverts every conventional understanding of operational surprise. The American Fifth Fleet knew the mission's general parameters: a special surface attack force, Okinawa as the target, a sortie planned for early April, before the Japanese ship captains who would carry out the mission had been briefed. Additional FRUPAC decrypts over the following days refined the picture further. By the 5th of April, messages intercepted and processed by both FRUPAC in Pearl Harbor and OP-20G in Washington, had confirmed the timing of the operation and mentioned the Yamato by name. On the same day that Vice Admiral Kusaka was flying into Tokuyama to brief the captains aboard the Yahagi, the meeting where they objected and were overruled, American fleet commanders already knew approximately when the force would sail, what ships it would include, and what its destination was. The briefing that shocked the Japanese captains was old news in Pearl Harbor. The intelligence infrastructure that made this possible was built over years of painstaking cryptanalytic work on the Japanese Navy's primary communications cipher, designated JN-25 in American intelligence terminology. The breaking of this system, a process that involved mathematical analysis, captured materials, and an extraordinary concentration of linguistic and analytical talent at facilities in Pearl Harbor, Washington, and Melbourne, had been progressively refined since the beginning of 1942. By 1945, the processing cycle from intercepted Japanese naval message to actionable intelligence summary had been compressed to a matter of hours in many cases. The Americans weren't just reading Japanese naval communications. They were reading them fast enough to do something about what they read. In the terminology that modern military analysts use, this was decision superiority. Not merely better information, but information delivered quickly enough to shape outcomes. Yamato sailed into a decision loop she was already inside before her anchor was raised. Spruance's operational response to the intelligence was measured and professional, in a way that tells you something important about the quality of American naval command by 1945. He didn't immediately order everything he had to converge on the Yamato. He didn't announce the intelligence to subordinates in ways that might compromise the source. He directed submarine forces, specifically to track and report rather than attack, both to conserve the intelligence advantage and because attacking a 22-knot zigzagging force in open water was not a high-probability proposition for submerged submarines. He positioned Task Force 58's carrier groups for optimal launch geometry northeast of Okinawa. He prepared a surface-blocking force of battleships as a backup contingency in case the carriers somehow missed. And he waited. The plan was calm, layered, and certain. The word ambush isn't quite right for what Spruance set up, because an ambush implies concealment and surprise. What Spruance arranged was closer to a scheduled appointment. The Yamato had one. She didn't know it. On the evening of the 6th of April, as the task force was transiting the Bungo Strait between the home islands of Kyushu and Shikoku, the submarine USS Threadfin made contact with the force at approximately 17:45 hours. Threadfin issued a contact report. She transmitted it in the clear, unencrypted, plain language, naming the force and providing composition, course, and speed. And here is the detail that I find the most operationally surreal in this entire story. The Yamato's own radio intelligence team intercepted the transmission. A Nisei translator aboard the Yahagi, a man born an American citizen who had been in Japan when the war began and had joined the IJN when the alternative was execution, translated the submarine's report in real time and relayed it to the bridge. The Japanese task force learned from an American submarine's unencrypted radio message that it was being tracked, reported, and discussed by name. They continued at 20 knots. What else could they do? The Nisei translator's name was Ensign Shigeo Yamada. His story is one of those historical threads that deserves far more attention than it has received in English-language accounts of this battle. Born an American citizen, studying in Japan when the Pacific War began, facing a choice that wasn't really a choice, he ended up serving in the radio intelligence section of a ship that was sailing toward its certain destruction. On the night of the 6th of April, he translated American submarine communications that were openly discussing the force he was part of. He survived the sinking of the Yahagi and was among the men recovered by the destroyer Fuyutsuki. His full post-war account, by all indications, has never been translated into English. He occupies a single paragraph in the NHHC analysis. He should occupy considerably more. The night transit was shadowed continuously. After Threadfin's initial contact, the submarine USS Hackleback picked up surveillance and issued 4 contact reports as the force moved southwest along the Kyushu coast, zigzagging on anti-submarine patterns that slowed the overall speed of advance, but failed to shake the trailing submarine. Japanese destroyers peeled off repeatedly to keep Hackleback at bay. Short counter-pursuit runs that ended quickly because the destroyers couldn't afford to fall far behind the main force. The radio traffic from both submarines, transmitted in plain language and mentioning the Yamato repeatedly, was being intercepted and retranslated aboard the Japanese ships throughout the night. Senior officers on the Yamato were aware, before dawn on the 7th of April, that American commanders had continuous positional data on the force, that the data was being transmitted in clear language, as if there were no concern about Japanese interception, and that the apparent reason there was no concern was that none of it made any operational difference. The trap didn't need to be hidden, it just needed to be there. 2 PBM-3 Martin Mariner flying boats from Patrol Bombing Squadron 21, operating from the tender Chandeleur at Karama-Reto, took over surveillance at mid-morning on the 7th of April. These were large, slow, relatively ungainly aircraft, designed for long-range maritime patrol rather than combat. They found the Yamato force, established visual contact, and began shadowing at the edge of visibility, mostly concealed in the cloud cover that was scattered across the area. At 10:17, the Yahagi commenced jamming the Mariner's communications frequencies. This was a reasonable defensive measure. Disrupting the shadowing aircraft's ability to transmit was better than doing nothing. But the Mariners had already been transmitting for long enough that the carrier task groups had the information they needed. By 10:17, the strike packages were assembled on the flight decks of task groups 58.1 and 58.3. The jamming was closing the barn door after the horse had been thoroughly reported, photographed, and scheduled for destruction. At 10:17, the Yamato opened fire with several of her main battery guns, throwing Sanshikidan shells at the Mariner flying boats. The 46-centimeter guns, the largest naval guns ever fitted to a warship, capable of throwing a 1,460-kilogram shell 26 miles, were being aimed at patrol flying boats that weighed approximately 33,000 kilograms fully loaded. The disproportion is almost too large to be absurd. The Mariners ducked back into the cloud cover and continued transmitting. The shells detonated in their programmed halos of incendiary effect and accomplished nothing. The world's largest guns had been used as an anti-nuisance measure against reconnaissance aircraft, and they had failed at that. At 10:00 hours, the promised Japanese fighter cover, 6-0 fighters, had reached their fuel limit and departed. The task force was now alone in the sky with American surveillance aircraft and the knowledge that somewhere beyond the cloud cover, the strike packages were already airborne. What the SIGINT story of Operation 10 Ichigo reveals, and what I think is its most important historical contribution, is that the Battle of the 7th of April, 1945, was not, in any meaningful sense, a battle of operational decision-making. The decisions had already been made, on both sides, days before the engagement. The Americans had decided how to respond to an attack they knew was coming. The Japanese had decided to proceed with an attack, despite knowing that the Americans knew it was coming. What happened over the East China Sea between approximately 12:30 and 14:30 hours on the 7th of April was the physical execution of decisions that had already been fixed. The Yamato was not sailing into an ambush, she was sailing into an outcome. The two things look similar from the outside, and are entirely different from the inside. Chapter 8. One morning in the East China Sea. Rice balls were delivered to the bridge at some point around midday. Lieutenant Yoshida, the target designating officer of the Yahagi, never got to eat his. By the time the rice arrived at his station, The battle had already started, and the battle, once it started, had no particular interest in anyone's lunch. This is the detail he records in his account of the 7th of April, 1945. This small, entirely human observation about missing a meal. And it is the detail that, for me, most accurately locates the experience of that morning. Not the tonnages, not the aircraft counts, not the tactical geometry. A young officer who hasn't eaten, standing at his station, watching the largest naval air attack of the Pacific War unfold in front of him. The rice balls were still there after the Yahagi was gone. The sea doesn't eat. The morning had begun in the particular kind of tension that exists when you know something is coming and you can't see it yet. The task force had cleared the Osumi Strait at the southern tip of Kyushu in the early hours of the 7th, and by dawn they were in open water. The formation reconfigured from the night's anti-submarine column into an anti-aircraft circular formation, with the Yamato at the center and the lighter ships arrayed around her. Breakfast was rice balls served at battle stations. At approximately 600 hours, just around sunrise, 9 Zero fighters appeared as promised, banking in from the right, dropping to escort altitude, taking up station overhead. They were, by any assessment of the tactical situation, 9 aircraft trying to protect 10 ships from whatever Task Force 58 was about to send. Nobody on the bridge of the Yahagi said this out loud. Some things are understood without being spoken. At 6:57, the destroyer Asashimo hoisted a signal. Engine casualty. She reported she could make 12 knots and would follow the main body. She began to fall behind almost immediately, her silhouette shrinking in the haze astern of the formation until she was a smudge on the horizon and then nothing. Lieutenant Yoshida records that the bridge of the Yahagi was in total silence after this. The Asashimo's departure was not in itself a military crisis. She was one destroyer, and the Yamato's fighting power didn't depend on her. But the symbolism was inescapable. One of their ships had broken down before the battle began. The Japanese hadn't caused it and couldn't fix it, and the operation was continuing anyway. The day of destiny, Yoshida called it, began under such circumstances. At around 8:15, the Yahagi launched a reconnaissance float plane from her catapult. A small aircraft that circled the task force briefly, reported the approach of enemy fighters, and then, rather sensibly, flew away toward the coast of Kyushu and landed at its home base. At approximately 8:45, 7 American F-6F Hellcat fighters appeared over the task force. They didn't attack. They orbited at altitude, maintaining a comfortable distance outside Japanese anti-aircraft range, circling in that patient, proprietorial way that well-armed aircraft can afford when they're not in any hurry. The 9 Zero fighters attempted to make contact with the Hellcats and couldn't find them in the cloud cover. The Hellcats continued orbiting. It was, in its way, a preview of the entire engagement. American aircraft doing exactly what they wanted, when they wanted, without interference. The moment the Zero fighters reached their fuel limit and departed, at approximately 1000 hours, the psychological character of the morning changed. Every officer on every bridge in the task force knew that the promised cover had now gone, that nothing stood between the ships and whatever was coming, and that the coming was probably not far away. The 2 Mariner flying boats had been visible intermittently since mid-morning, lurking in the cloud banks, dropping below the overcast to confirm position, and then climbing back into cover before anyone could draw a proper bead on them. The Yamato had fired her main battery at them. The shells had accomplished nothing. Now the mariners were still there, and the fighters were gone, and the American carrier task groups were somewhere over the northern horizon, assembling their strike packages. And everyone on the bridge of the Yahagi understood, with professional clarity, that the time remaining could be measured in tens of minutes rather than hours. At 1107, Yamato's Type 13 air search radar detected a large aircraft formation inbound at the instrument's maximum range of 63 nautical miles. The formation was already splitting into two groups. Speed was increased to 25 knots. 8 minutes later, at 11:15, the radar showed the two groups at 44 miles, closing fast. A 30-minute-old report from a Japanese observation post on a small island north of Okinawa arrived around the same time, reporting 150 American aircraft headed in the task force's direction. The report was already obsolete by the time it arrived. The actual number was closer to 227 in the first wave. And then, at 12:32, a lookout on one of the ships sighted the first incoming strike wave on the horizon. Not individual aircraft yet, but the kind of darkness on the edge of vision that resolves, as it closes, into a very large number of aircraft. Captain Hara on the Yahagi observed that the large American formations circled the task force for some minutes before attacking, outside anti-aircraft range, organizing strike assignments on specific targets with no Japanese fighter interference. This methodical pre-attack organization, conducted in full view of the ships they were about to hit, was itself a kind of operational statement. The American strike leaders were taking their time. They had the fuel, the aircraft, the altitude, and the absence of opposition to take their time. They were arranging the attack the way a competent professional arranges any complex task, carefully, without rushing, getting the geometry right. At 12:34, before the first aircraft started its run, the Yamato opened fire with her two forward main battery turrets, Sanshikidan rounds fused at approximately 1 second of flight time, detonating in enormous halos of fire at roughly 3,000 yards from the ship. The aircraft flew through the halos. At 12:37, the attack began. What happened over the next few minutes happened very fast and in multiple directions simultaneously, which is how air attacks on ships always work, and which is why eyewitness accounts of them are always partial and slightly contradictory. Fighters came in first, strafing at low level, specifically targeting the anti-aircraft gun positions and their crews, not the ship's structure. This was deliberate American doctrine by 1945. Kill the gunners before the bombers and torpedo planes arrive, and the ship's defensive fire becomes progressively less effective as the attack develops. Helldivers from the Bennington and Hornet attacked from the port side, with a series of near misses that raised columns of water all around the Yamato as she maneuvered at flank speed. Two 1,000-pound armor-piercing bombs hit at approximately 12:40 hours. One exploded in crew quarters, the other hit near the aft command station, knocking out an air search radar, destroying a secondary gun director, and starting a fire in the after secondary gun turret that couldn't be extinguished and killed all but one crewman at that station. At 12:43, 5 Avenger torpedo bombers from the Hornet came in from the port side, while Corsairs strafed and hit with rockets that were lethal to the anti-aircraft gunners, even when they didn't damage the ship's structure. One Avenger was shot down. 3 torpedoes entered the water. Yamato avoided 2 of them, her captain throwing the enormous hull into evasive maneuvers with a skill that multiple accounts acknowledge as genuinely impressive. But the 3rd torpedo hit her port side at approximately 12:45. She took on 2,235 tons of water immediately. The damage control teams responded with textbook efficiency, counterflooding to correct the list. It worked. The ship came back to upright. For approximately 15 minutes, the system was functioning as designed. The light cruiser Yahagi had steered away from the Yamato at the start of the attack, trying to draw some of the strike aircraft toward a different target. It worked too well. At 12:46, a torpedo hit her engine room and killed the entire engineering watch section. The Yahagi stopped dead in the water. Yoshida felt the ship go quiet beneath him, in a way that was, he wrote, more disturbing than any explosion. The battle continued around the stopped cruiser, bombs and torpedoes walking across the formation. The destroyer Hamikaze hit amidships and broken in two. The destroyer Suzutsuki losing her entire bow section to a bomb hit. And the Yamato kept moving, taking hits, counteracting them, being hit again. The water rising inside her compartments with each successive strike. The margin for correction narrowing with each torpedo that found her hull. The men in the damage control center working faster and with less reliable information as the battle accumulated its costs. The first wave of the attack ending at approximately 12:50, and the radar already detecting the second wave inbound. Chapter 9. The torpedo that made the decision. The second and third American attack waves did not arrive as a single coordinated mass. They came in overlapping sequences. The 50 aircraft of Task Group 58.3 arriving at approximately 1302, followed roughly 30 minutes later by the 115 aircraft of Task Group 58.4, and the effect was a sustained rolling assault that gave the Yamato's damage control teams no recovery time between strikes. This matters technically because the counter-flooding system that had successfully corrected the list after the first torpedo hit required time to work. The crew needed to assess the flooding, calculate the counterbalancing volume required, open the flood valves to the correct compartments, and monitor the correction. With new hits arriving every few minutes, that cycle couldn't complete before it was interrupted by the next event. The water was rising faster than the system could answer it. By the time Task Group 58.4 arrived at approximately 13:25, the Yamato had absorbed further bomb hits and at least 2 more torpedo strikes from the second wave. She was moving at approximately 8 to 10 knots, dramatically reduced from the 25 knots she had been making when the attack began, partly from flooding reducing propulsive efficiency, and partly because the decision had been made to flood the starboard engine room to correct a developing port list, a measure that worked but reduced available power significantly. At 8 to 10 knots, a ship the size of the Yamato is not maneuvering. She is drifting with purpose. Her ability to throw off torpedo attack by violent evasive action, which had been genuine and effective in the early stages of the engagement, was now largely gone. She was, in the tactical language of the era, a sitting target, and the aircraft of Task Group 58.4 were about to make very specific decisions about what to do with a sitting target. Lieutenant Tom Stetson commanded the torpedo squadron of the USS Lexington, Torpedo Squadron 9, or VT-9 in standard American naval designation. His 13 Avenger torpedo bombers had been ordered to attack the Yahagi. When Stetson arrived over the battle area and assessed the situation, he saw a different picture than his orders had anticipated. The Yahagi was already dead in the water, clearly finished, while the Yamato, though badly damaged, was still moving under her own power and still presented the genuine possibility of surviving, if not hit immediately with concentrated torpedo fire. Stetson requested and received permission from his strike leader to split his force. 7 Avengers would attack the Yahagi as ordered. 6 would go after the Yamato, with their torpedo depth settings changed to 20 feet, shallower than the standard attack setting, to target the battleship's exposed underwater hull. The reason for the shallower depth setting was not arbitrary. It was the product of observing the Yamato's condition from the air. By this point in the engagement, the cumulative effect of torpedo hits on the port side, combined with the counterflooding of starboard compartments, had produced a list to port that was becoming difficult to correct. As the ship listed, her starboard armor belt, the 410mm Vickers hardened steel that represented the primary defense against enemy shell fire, rose progressively out of the water. The starboard side of the ship, designed and armored to face enemy guns at medium to long range, was lifting clear. The relatively thin hull plating below the armor belt, the bottom of the ship, engineered for structural integrity rather than armor protection, was becoming accessible from the starboard side. Setting torpedoes to run at 20 feet was a decision to aim at the bottom of the ship rather than its side. It was a decision to hit the Yamato where she wasn't armored. The attack on the Yahagi was, in its own terms, devastatingly precise. Lieutenant Yoshida's account, written from the deck of the ship being attacked, describes the 7 Avengers of Lieutenant Lee's division approaching in 2 lines abreast, a textbook formation executed under fire. 5 torpedoes entered the water. The post-action account from one of the attacking pilots, Lieutenant Bass, describes turning after his weapon release and watching all 5 torpedoes connect in rapid succession, the impacts walking along the hull, the cruiser erupting, and then, for a moment, nothing, before she began to go. The Yahagi made a half roll and sank at approximately 1405 hours. She had absorbed 12 bomb hits and 7 torpedo strikes. In the final assessment, it took 38 minutes for 19 weapon impacts to sink a ship of 7,710 tons. The Yamato, at 71,659 tons, was absorbing an equivalent rate of fire and was still afloat, but only just. Stetson's 6 Avengers arrived over the Yamato as she continued in a slow starboard circle. Her steering had been damaged, her speed reduced to 8 knots, her list now perceptibly increasing despite the counterflooding efforts continuing below. The depth settings were set to 20 feet. The attack came in from the starboard side, where the armor belt was now partly out of the water. American accounts credit multiple torpedo hits in this phase of the attack and the forensic evidence from the wreck. Torpedo impact signatures on both port and starboard sides of the hull confirms that the final phase of the attack was striking the ship from both directions simultaneously, negating the defensive value of the armor belt regardless of which way the ship was listing. Stetson's unauthorized modification of his orders, the split of his force, the depth setting adjustment, the decision to attack from the exposed side, was operationally decisive and was made in the space of a few seconds of airborne assessment. He got permission. He did it. It worked. There is a source conflict embedded in the question of what actually killed the Yamato, and I think it's worth naming it directly, rather than letting the narrative bury it. American after-action reports, naturally structured around what American aircraft did and achieved, tend to identify specific torpedo strikes, particularly those of the final attack waves, as the killing blows. The reports credit individual squadrons with hits that produce specific, observable effects. Japanese survivor accounts, particularly Rear Admiral Morishita's post-war testimony, describe the ship's end differently, not as the result of a specific killing torpedo, but as the product of progressive systemic failure. Flooding that accumulated beyond the capacity of the counter-flooding system to correct. Stability that degraded non-linearly once the list passed a critical threshold. Damage control resources that had been depleted by the battle's earlier stages. Both descriptions are accurate. They're describing the same event from different positions of knowledge. The torpedo hits were the mechanism. The systemic failure was the cause. The distinction matters if you're trying to understand what it takes to sink a ship of this size, and it matters less if you're trying to understand why the ship sank when it did. At approximately 1342, another salvo of Avenger torpedoes hit the port side. At 1343, 4 more torpedoes were inbound and 2 connected. The Yamato's speed was now reduced to the point where evasive maneuvering was impossible. The concentrated attacks on her stern, specifically designed to destroy her steering, had locked her into a slow starboard turn that she couldn't break out of. At 1402, she took 3 more bomb hits amidships. At 1407, a torpedo hit the starboard side. At 1417, 2 more hit the port side. The executive officer had already reported to Captain Aruga that the damage control officers were dead and that the counter-flooding system could no longer correct the list. Vice Admiral Ito, from his position in the flag spaces, sent a signal by flag hoist. The radios had been destroyed, cancelling the operation and releasing surviving ships to attempt to return to Japan. The tactical premise of the operation had ceased to apply approximately 2 hours after it began. The men who had been flooding starboard compartments to correct the port list had bought time. They had done their jobs correctly and with genuine professional skill, and they had kept the ship functional for longer than it might otherwise have been. The flooding of the starboard engine room in the middle phases of the battle, the measure that corrected the developing list and slowed the capsize, had worked, temporarily, and had also, with insufficient warning time, drowned an unknown number of crewmen trapped in those spaces when the flood valves opened. This is the part of the damage control narrative that tends to get compressed in accounts focused on tactical action. Men were deliberately drowned to save the ship. The ship sank anyway. The decision to flood those compartments was the right call given the information available at the time it was made, and it remains a deeply uncomfortable fact. The last operational note I want to register here is about what Yamato didn't do. She carried 9 Type 94 main battery guns, each capable of throwing a 3,200-pound armor-piercing shell 26 miles. She carried 6 secondary battery guns. She carried over 200 anti-aircraft weapons of various calibers. She departed Tokuyama with 1,170 main battery shells, 1,629 secondary battery shells, 13,500 anti-aircraft shells, and 11.5 million rounds of machine gun ammunition. The United States Navy lost 10 aircraft and 12 aircrewmen in the entire engagement. Not a single American surface ship was damaged. The most heavily armed warship ever built, on the only offensive mission of her career, did not sink a ship, did not damage a ship, and did not, in any material sense, alter the strategic situation she had been sent to address. The arithmetic of that outcome is its own kind of historical verdict. Chapter 10. The Capsize. 2 minutes. At approximately 1408 hours on the 7th of April, 1945, the main deck of the Yamato was no longer horizontal. The list to port had passed 45 degrees, which means the surface that 3,000 men had been standing, working, fighting, and in some cases dying on for the past 2 hours, was now closer to a wall than a floor. Men who had been on the upper decks were clinging to whatever was fixed and solid. Men in enclosed compartments below were standing on the walls of those compartments, in water that was rising from below and falling from overhead simultaneously as the ship's geometry ceased to correspond to any recognizable human orientation. The sea was already coming over the port rail in continuous sheets. The starboard armor belt, 410 millimeters of the hardest steel Japan could produce, was rising out of the water as the ship rolled, lifting clear, exposing the relatively unprotected bottom plating to the remaining aircraft still orbiting the battle area. At 1420, the main deck was vertical. What happened in the 12 minutes between the abandoned ship order and the magazine detonation is the part of this story that the numbers cannot fully contain. Captain Kosaku Aruga gave the order to abandon ship at approximately 1402. The timing matters because it came several minutes before the list became physically unsurvivable. There was a window, however narrow, in which men on the upper decks could get into the water while the ship still provided some shelter from the suction that a capsizing hull creates. Aruga gave the order and then lashed himself to the binnacle, the compass housing on the bridge, with rope. This was not improvised. It was a deliberate act. He intended to go down with the ship, and he intended to remain at his post on the bridge when he did it, which required securing himself against the progressive roll that was already making the deck unnavigable. Vice Admiral Ito had already retired to his stateroom before the abandoned ship order was given. Both men were making, in the language available to them, the decision they had decided to make before the battle began. Rear Admiral Nobuo Morishita Yamato's chief of staff, and the senior officer who would survive the battle, attempted to reach Captain Aruga after the abandoned ship order to transmit some final operational communication, and was unable to make his way to the bridge against the ship's angle. This small detail appears in post-war accounts and matters because it illustrates what the interior of the ship was like at that point. A space where normal navigation had become impossible, where companionways and ladders were now angled at degrees that made movement against the roll a physical struggle, where the geometry of every enclosed space was continuously changing. Men who were below decks when the list passed 30 degrees and couldn't reach an exit in time were, in a practical sense, already lost. Whether they knew this depended on where they were and what they could see and hear. The physics of what happens to a ship when it capsizes are described with precision in naval architecture texts and experienced by anyone inside as something that doesn't map onto any prior experience. As the hull rotates around its longitudinal axis, the water that has been flooding compartments from below now redistributes according to the new geometry. What was the floor becomes the wall. What was the wall becomes the ceiling. The flooding water follows gravity to the new low point. The free surface effect of water in partially flooded compartments, which had been reducing the ship's metacentric height throughout the battle, progressively eating away at her ability to self-right. Now the surface of the water was covered in heavy fuel oil, the expelled contents of Yamato's tanks as the hull was torn open, and men in the water were being coated in a viscous black layer that stung the eyes, filled the mouth and nose with a taste that survivor accounts describe consistently, and made the already cold water feel like something heavier and more hostile than water. At approximately 1422, the number 1 forward main battery magazine detonated. The shell and propellant storage for turret number 1, containing most of the unused main battery ammunition, since Yamato had fired relatively few rounds during the engagement, ignited in a detonation of a scale that had no precedent in the Pacific theater. A Japanese navigation officer on one of the surviving destroyers calculated afterward that the pillar of fire reached approximately 2,000 meters in height, and that the mushroom-shaped smoke cloud rose to approximately 6,000 meters. These are estimates made from a distance, under battlefield conditions, by an observer who was simultaneously managing a damaged ship, and they should be treated as approximations. What they describe is a blast visible from the Japanese home island of Kyushu, approximately 200 miles away. Civilian witnesses in the Kagoshima area, on the southern tip of Kyushu, reported seeing a large explosion on the southern horizon. Some understood what they were seeing. Most learned only later. The men who died in the magazine detonation were, in large part, men who had survived everything that came before it. They were the men who had gotten off the ship, who had made it into the water, who had been swimming or clinging to debris in the minutes between the abandoned ship order and the explosion. The blast pressure from a detonation of this magnitude, traveling outward through water, which transmits shock waves far more efficiently than air, was lethal at ranges that extended well beyond the ship's hull. The NHHC analysis notes, carefully, that more American aircraft may have been damaged or destroyed by the magazine explosion's pressure wave than by Japanese anti-aircraft fire during the entire preceding engagement. The ship that had been largely unable to defend itself against aircraft in combat became briefly, catastrophically lethal to everything near it at the moment of its own death. The exact number of men aboard the Yamato when she sailed is not definitively established, and this is a source conflict that I want to name directly. The NHHC analysis, which I've relied on heavily for the operational detail of this account, gives a crew of 3,332, with 3,055 killed. The USNI account by Lieutenant Yoshida, drawing on Japanese memorial records compiled over decades, gives a killed figure of 2,740, with 117 wounded among the survivors. which implies a different total. The discrepancy is not small. It reflects the fundamental difficulty of casualty accounting for a ship sunk with almost all hands, whose records went to the bottom with her, and whose personnel registers were maintained by officers who did not survive to verify them. I use the NHHC figures as the more methodologically documented source, while acknowledging openly that the Japanese memorial records tell a partially different story, and that both sets of numbers are approximations of a loss that was, in any case, of an order that makes the precise figure feel almost irrelevant to the human reality. The counter-flooding decisions made during the battle, particularly the flooding of the starboard engine rooms to correct the earlier port list, had saved the ship temporarily and had drowned an unknown number of crew in those spaces. The number is unknown because the men in those compartments did not survive to give accounts, and no one who was not in those spaces can say with certainty how much warning they received, or whether any of them managed to escape before the flood valves opened. Survivor testimony from adjacent spaces suggests the warning was minimal, perhaps 30 seconds, perhaps less. This is, in the damage control narrative of the battle, the moment that refuses to be absorbed into tactical analysis. Men were deliberately flooded to save the ship. The decision was professionally correct given the information available. The ship sank anyway. There is no framework in which that becomes comfortable. The wreck now lies at approximately 340 meters depth in the East China Sea, roughly 180 miles southwest of Kagoshima. It broke into two main sections at the point of the magazine detonation. A bow to midship section, approximately 560 feet long, and a stern section of approximately 264 feet, plus a debris field covering an estimated 3 to 4 square kilometers of seabed. The three main battery turrets, each weighing approximately 2,774 tons, rest inverted near the hull sections, displaced from their barbettes by the capsize. The forward magazine area, where the detonation originated, shows outward displacement of hull plating, consistent with internal explosion rather than torpedo impact. The steel blown away from the source, rather than inward toward it. The ship's physical remains tell the story of its end, with the precision that only forensic evidence can provide. The last thing I want to say about the capsize is about the men lashed to the binnacle and sitting in the stateroom. Captain Aruga had been described in some accounts as a rear admiral by virtue of accelerated wartime promotion. The records on his exact rank at the time of the battle are themselves slightly ambiguous, as the NHHC analysis notes. He was posthumously promoted to Vice Admiral. Vice Admiral Ito was posthumously promoted to Full Admiral. These posthumous promotions were, in the logic of the Imperial Japanese Navy, the appropriate honors for officers who had gone down with their command. Both men were inside the ship when the magazine detonated. Neither man's body was recovered. The binnacle Aruga had lashed himself to went to the bottom with the ship. At 340 meters, in the debris field that the survey expeditions have documented, there may be pieces of it still. Chapter 11. The Men Who Got Out. The water temperature in the East China Sea in early April is approximately 15 to 17 degrees Celsius. This is cold enough to matter physiologically, cold enough to begin the process of muscular cooling within the first hour of immersion for an unprotected swimmer, cold enough to produce involuntary inhalation if a wave breaks over the face and cold water hits the throat, cold enough to reduce swimming efficiency progressively until the body simply stops responding to the instructions the mind is giving it. 2 to 4 hours is the approximate time frame for loss of consciousness in unprotected cold water at this temperature range. The rescue operation conducted by the surviving Japanese destroyers lasted approximately 4 hours total. The men who were found in the first 2 hours generally survived. The men who were found later, or not found at all, generally didn't. In the debris field and the oil slick that covered several square miles of the East China Sea on the afternoon of the 7th of April, 1945, approximately 3,000 men were in the water simultaneously. 269 of them were recovered. The oil was everywhere. Yamato's tanks had expelled their contents as the hull was torn open. Approximately 2,000 to 4,000 tons of heavy mazout fuel, spreading across the surface in a viscous black layer that floated on top of the cold water and coated everything it touched. Men in the water were covered in it within minutes of entering the sea. Lieutenant Yoshida describes in his account trying to open his eyes in the water and finding them sealed by the oil, having to push his hand down below the oil layer to reach clean water, wipe his eyes, and then, critically, keep his hand clenched in a fist as he raised it above the oil surface, so the clean water on his skin didn't immediately acquire another coating before he could use it. The precision of that physical problem, the specific difficulty of cleaning one's hand to wipe one's eyes while floating in fuel oil in cold water after surviving a sinking, is the kind of detail that no narrative reconstruction can improve upon. He remembered it 60 years later, because the body remembers what mattered. The heavy oil had paradoxical survival effects. On one hand, it was toxic. Ingested with seawater, it caused acute nausea, vomiting, and respiratory distress. And Yoshida mentions feeling sick and throwing up in the water, having not eaten since before the battle began, his empty stomach filling with oil and seawater. On the other hand, the oil coating on a swimmer's skin and clothing acted as a partial thermal barrier, imperfect, incomplete, but real enough to potentially extend survival time beyond what the water temperature alone would have produced. There is no way to know how many men owed their survival partly to being covered in fuel oil. There is also no way to know how many men were incapacitated by oil inhalation, who might otherwise have survived. The oil was simultaneously killing some and preserving others, indifferently. The surviving destroyers, Yukikaze, Fuyutsuki, Hatsushimo, and the badly damaged Suzutsuki, began rescue operations after the American aircraft departed the area. American accounts record that attacks on destroyers ceased when the ships were visibly engaged in picking up survivors. Japanese accounts, including Yoshida's, described continued machine gun strafing of men in the water after the ships had sunk, aircraft making passes over the oil slick and firing into groups of survivors. Both accounts are probably accurate as descriptions of different aircraft, different moments, different targeting decisions made by individual pilots operating under the general pressure of combat. Neither account fully exonerates or fully condemns. What can be said is that rescue operations were conducted under conditions that were not safe. The destroyers were maneuvering at speed to avoid further attack, even while attempting to retrieve men from the water, and that the recovery of approximately 1,620 survivors across all the sunken ships was accomplished by crews who were themselves damaged, exhausted, and operating without air cover in waters that had just destroyed 6 of their 10 ships. Yoshida describes hearing, from other survivors floating near him, a gradual change in the quality of sound. At first, there were voices, men encouraging each other, exchanging words, some singing Navy songs to maintain the kind of group cohesion that conscious effort can sustain in the early stages of cold water immersion. Then the voices became less frequent. Then some of them stopped entirely, as the men producing them lost the muscular control required to speak, and then the consciousness required to want to. The survivors who were still functional hours after the sinking weren't physically different from the men who died. They weren't stronger or more determined in any way that could be specified. They were mostly in the right position relative to debris, or they were found by a destroyer that happened to pass close enough, or they had body compositions that slowed the heat loss very slightly. The difference between surviving and not surviving in cold, oil-covered water after several hours was largely a matter of proximity and chance, rather than anything the individual could control or determine. The destroyer Fuyutsuki was the ship that rescued Yoshida. He describes seeing it appear, a shape that resolved from the horizon into a recognizable warship, and being unable to open his eyes to confirm it because of the oil. Going through the process of cleaning his hand and wiping his eyes, managing to see the ship clearly. When he reached the hull and tried to climb the lifeline hanging over the side, he found his hands wouldn't work properly. 4 fingers on each hand were stuck together, unable to separate or grip. He had been in the water long enough that fine motor control was compromised. He describes climbing with hands that functioned more like paddles than hands, reaching the deck, walking unsteadily to the sailor's compartment. The navigator of the Fuyutsuki was Lieutenant Nakata, a classmate of Yoshida's from the Naval Academy. He was lying in bed, wounded in both wrists by machine gun fire. 2 men from the same class at the same school, on different ships in the same battle, meeting on the deck of a 3rd ship after the battle ended. The Pacific War produced these coincidences constantly, at a scale that made the world feel very small and very brutal simultaneously. The men who died in the water but after the magazine explosion, who had survived the sinking itself and made it into the sea, represent a category of loss that tends to get absorbed into the aggregate casualty figure without particular acknowledgement. Of the roughly 3,055 deaths attributed to the Yamato's loss, a very large proportion, the NHHC analysis suggests the majority, occurred at the moment of the magazine detonation, killing men who had been in the water for perhaps 10 to 20 minutes after abandoning ship. But a significant number died in the hours that followed, from cold, from oil inhalation, from exhaustion, from the simple arithmetic of too long in too cold water without a ship nearby. These deaths are not dramatic. They don't appear in after-action reports with the clarity of bomb and torpedo impacts. They happened quietly, scattered across several square miles of the East China Sea, over the course of an afternoon. The psychological experience of the survivors in the immediate aftermath is documented in fragments, Yoshida's account being the most extensive, supplemented by shorter testimonies in memorial records and oral histories collected by Japanese historians decades later. What comes through consistently is not trauma in the clinical sense that modern frameworks would apply, but something more like altered orientation, the sense of having passed through a threshold that the familiar categories of experience couldn't accommodate. Several men, Yoshida records, sank after thrashing briefly and never resurfaced. The survivors watched this happen and continued floating. The capacity to help others had been reduced by the water temperature and the oil and the exhaustion to essentially zero. Witnessing without intervening is its own specific experience, and the men who survived carried that specificity with them for the rest of their lives. Rear Admiral Morishita, the senior surviving officer from the Yamato herself, reported to the Naval General Staff on the 16th of April, 1945, 9 days after the battle. His report, as cited in post-war historical accounts, contains a passage that stands as the most honest official military assessment produced by any Japanese officer in the entire Pacific War. He argued, in explicit terms, that any assault operation requires thorough preparation and a plan in which favorable odds can be expected. That without these conditions, great loss and little benefit should be expected. The action report of Destroyer Squadron 2 was, by available accounts, equally stern. Naval operations must be cautiously and calculatingly executed. These were not the reports of defeated men making excuses. They were the professional conclusions of officers who had just watched what happens when military hierarchy overrules professional judgment and sends ships into an engagement whose outcome was never in genuine doubt. Morishita filed his report. The Naval General Staff received it. The war continued. Captain Hara, rescued by the Hatsushimo and taken to Sasebo, spent his first night back ashore at the submarine support facility. He was overheard that night by another Yahagi survivor, in conversation with a combined fleet staff officer who had come to hear the details of the battle. The survivor reported hearing Hara's voice, angry, precise, professional. The content of what Hara said in that hallway conversation is not recorded. He would write about it later, in his memoir, in terms that were measured and coherent, and still clearly furious at the operational logic that had sent his ship and his crew to sea in those conditions. He had said before departure that the mission would be like throwing an egg against a rock. He said it publicly, in a briefing attended by senior officers, 9 days before the battle. He said it in the form of a professional judgment that was correct in every particular. He was overruled. He went anyway. He survived. He spent the rest of his life as the only Japanese surface ship commander who was there at the beginning and there at the end, carrying that knowledge in the particular way that survivors of correctly predicted disasters always carry it. Chapter 12. What Morrison Got Wrong. Samuel Eliot Morrison was probably the finest narrative naval historian the United States produced in the 20th century. He was a Harvard professor, a rear admiral in the United States Naval Reserve, a man who had sailed on American warships during the Second World War, specifically to accumulate the kind of operational knowledge that produces credible historical writing. His 15-volume History of United States Naval Operations in World War II is a monument of sustained historical effort. Ambitious in scope, rich in operational detail, and written with a command of prose that most military historians can only observe from a respectful distance. It is also wrong about some specific things regarding the 7th of April, 1945. And the way it's wrong, and why it has stayed wrong in popular accounts for 70 years, is itself a story worth telling. Not to diminish Morrison, but because historiographical errors have their own archaeology, and examining them tells you something about how history gets made and how it stays made once the first strong version establishes itself. The most clearly documented error involves the identity of the first Japanese ship sunk during the Yamato operation. Morrison identifies this ship as the destroyer Hamikaze, based on a report from the USS San Jacinto, crediting aircraft from that carrier with the kill. The NHHC analysis, published in 2020 by director Samuel Cox, drawing on photographic evidence and hull classification records, establishes that the ship destroyed in the early phase of the attack, lagging behind the main force with engine trouble, was the Asashimo, not the Hamikaze. The photographic record shows a Yugumo-class destroyer sinking separately from the main engagement area. Asashimo was Yugumo-class, and she had been falling behind since dawn with reported engine casualty. Hamikaze was lost later, in the main action area, broken in two by torpedo hits. San Jacinto's report, which Morrison accepted without cross-referencing against available photographic evidence or hull-type identification, misidentified the first kill. The error propagated through decades of subsequent writing, because Morrison's authority was sufficient to make his account the reference point that later researchers consulted rather than challenged. This is not a trivial mistake in the way that a misquoted date or a misspelled name is trivial. The Asashimo's loss is operationally significant precisely because it was separate from the main engagement. She was attacked and sunk while the rest of the force was still hours from contact, by aircraft that had found her lagging and alone. All 330 of her crew were lost, every man aboard. The specific character of that loss, the most isolated, the most complete, the most preventable in some sense, since she arguably shouldn't have sailed given her mechanical condition, is effaced by the misidentification. In the historical record as Morrison established it, the Asashimo becomes a footnote attached to a different ship's name. In the Japanese memorial record, she is the most tragic ship of the operation. The death toll figures present a different kind of problem, not an identifiable error in the same sense, but a genuine discrepancy between sources that hasn't been cleanly resolved. Morrison gives Yamato survivors as 23 officers and 246 enlisted men, a total that doesn't quite match his other figures, but falls in a similar range to the NHHC's 269. The US NI account, drawing on Japanese memorial research conducted over decades by people with direct access to family records and survivor testimonies, gives a killed figure of 2,740, implying a different total crew figure than the NHHC's 3,332. The discrepancy between these two crew totals is over 300 men, which is not a rounding error. It's a meaningful difference in the denominator that affects every percentage calculation about survival rates and casualty proportions. I use the NHHC figures as the more methodologically explicit source, while being clear that the Japanese memorial records tell a partially different story. Both sets of numbers are approximations. The underlying reality that between 2,700 and 3,000 men died is consistent across all accounts, even when the specific numbers disagree. The question of one-way fuel is where the established historical narrative most systematically departs from the available primary evidence, and it's a departure with interpretive consequences. Morrison's account, and most popular histories following it, describe the Yamato as having been provided with fuel only for a one-way trip, emphasizing this as evidence of the Japanese High Command's complete indifference to any possibility of the crew's survival. This interpretation is emotionally compelling and politically coherent in the context of other Japanese wartime practices. It is also, based on the NHHC analysis, drawing on USSBS interrogations of logistics personnel, not fully accurate. The original instruction from Tokyo was indeed for one-way fuel. The fuel depot at Tokuyama, operating under local authority, provided approximately 4,000 metric tons, more than the one-way instruction, but not a full operational load. The surviving destroyers were filled as completely as available stocks permitted, some apparently with fuel blends that included vegetable oil to make up the deficit. The picture that emerges from the logistics records is more complicated than simple indifference. There was a one-way instruction from command, a practical modification of that instruction at the depot level, and an operational reality that the mission would be terminal regardless of the fuel quantity. The one-way fuel framing is not invented. It was the original command intent. But it's not the complete picture. Japanese accounts of the same battle present their own internal inconsistencies, and it's worth acknowledging these without using them to dismiss the Japanese sources entirely. Masanori Ito's The End of the Imperial Japanese Navy, published in Japanese in 1956, and the first serious Japanese attempt to account for the battle, was written by a journalist who had been embedded with the Navy during the war, not by a naval officer or a survivor. His account is well researched for its time and shaped by a clear personal commitment to honoring the dead without condemning the institutional decisions that killed them. This is not dishonesty. It is the natural orientation of a man writing about a national disaster for a national audience in the first years of Reconstruction, at a moment when the capacity for institutional self-criticism was limited by political and social pressures that had nothing to do with historical accuracy. His account of the battle is, in some respects, more reverential than analytical, and this shapes what it emphasizes and what it minimizes. Captain Hara's memoir, published in 1961, is a different kind of document, more critical, more professionally precise, more willing to name the operational failures at the command level. Hara was a survivor writing from personal experience, with a professional sailor's eye for the specific decisions that had been wrong. His account of the April 5th briefing, the meeting where the captains objected and were overruled, is the most detailed we have from the Japanese side, and it has been used by essentially every subsequent historian working on this subject. But Hara was also constructing a narrative of himself as the officer who had seen clearly and said so and been ignored. which is accurate, but is also a narrative with its own internal logic about who was right and who was wrong. Using Hara as a primary source requires holding in mind that he was not simply reporting what happened. He was also, in the way all memoirists are, interpreting what happened in light of what he had come to understand about it over the 16 years between the battle and the book. Lieutenant Yoshida's account, published in English in the USNI Naval History magazine in October of 2007, is the latest of the major Japanese participant accounts and, in some ways, the most textured. Yoshida was 23 years old on the 7th of April, 1945. He was 83 or thereabouts when his account was published, writing with the retrospective clarity and the retrospective shaping of a life spent returning to the same set of events. What I find most striking about his account is not the tactical detail, which is accurate and useful, but the two registers of reflection it maintains simultaneously. One that accepts the spiritual framing of the mission as an expression of Yamato Damashi, and one that is analytically precise about its futility. He doesn't choose between these registers, he holds them both, which is exactly what surviving something like this probably requires. The August 2024 Asahi Shimbun report deserves specific discussion here because it represents a potential revision to the established causal narrative at its most fundamental level. The report, drawing on newly examined Imperial Palace documents, argues that what has been understood as Emperor Hirohito's March 29th question, the implicit criticism of the Navy's inaction that triggered Toyota's decision to order the sortie, may have been misattributed in date, and that the Naval General Staff's interpretation of the question as an imperial mandate for action may not reflect what Hirohito actually intended. The Palace documents reportedly show the question as a genuine inquiry rather than a directive. If this reading of the newly available materials holds up to scholarly scrutiny, and as of early 2026 it has not been definitively confirmed or challenged in the peer-reviewed literature, it would mean that the Naval General Staff interpreted an innocent question as a mandate because the institutional logic of the moment required a mandate. It would mean the Yamato was sent to her death partly because a group of senior officers needed a reason that would override professional objection, and found it in a misreading of a question asked by a man in wire-framed spectacles who may have been genuinely curious rather than implicitly critical. The reason this historiographical work matters, the reason tracing these errors and discrepancies is worth the time in a documentary about a battle that ended 8 decades ago, is that the Yamato story is not over. It continues to be used in Japanese public discourse, in military history, in debates about what Japan's Pacific War was and meant, and why it ended as it did. The version of the story that exists in the public memory is the version that was established first, by sources that were themselves shaped by the political and personal pressures of their moment. Correcting Morrison on the Asashimo identification doesn't change the battle's outcome. It changes what the battle actually was. And in history, the distinction between the accurate account and the comfortable account is the distinction that determines whether the past can actually teach anything to the present. Chapters 13 through 17. Full documentary script. Chapter 13. The Other Ships. On the 8th of April, 1945, 4 destroyers arrived at Sasebo Naval Base on the western coast of Kyushu. They were the Yukikaze, the Fuyutsuki, the Hatsushimo, and the Suzutsuki. The Suzutsuki arrived last, and she arrived stern first, because her entire bow section had been destroyed by a bomb hit during the engagement, and her commander had concluded, correctly as it turned out, that the intact stern could be navigated in reverse over the roughly 600 nautical miles separating the battle site from the base. She steamed in reverse for approximately 3 days. She was never repaired. She sat in Sasebo for the remainder of the war and was eventually scrapped there. But she made it back, which is more than 6 of her companions managed, and the seamanship required to bring a ship home without its bow, navigating in reverse across open water, is the kind of operational detail that tends to disappear entirely in accounts organized around the Yamato's destruction. The Yamato is the story everyone tells. The Suzutsuki is the story that gets left in the harbor. The 10 ships that sailed from Tokuyama on the 6th of April 1945 carried between them a combined displacement of approximately 97,000 tons and crews totaling somewhere in the vicinity of 10,000 men, depending on which accounting you use. Of those ships, 6 were sunk. Of those 10,000 men, approximately 4,242 died. The standard narrative of the battle, the one organized around the Yamato as the central object, with the other ships as background, systematically underweights what happened to the other 9 vessels and the 9,000 men who weren't aboard the flagship. The light cruiser Yahagi and her crew of roughly 1,000 men, of whom 446 died. The destroyer Asashimo and her crew of approximately 330, every one of whom died. The Hamikaze, broken in 2 by torpedo hits, losing 100 men with 257 rescued. Each of these losses is a complete story. None of them get a documentary. The Yahagi deserves particular attention, partly because she produced the most detailed survivor account of the battle in Lieutenant Yoshida's memoir, and partly because her own fighting history before April of 1945 was more extensive than the Yamato's. She had fought in the Battle of the Philippine Sea in June of 1944, had been present at Leyte Gulf in October of the same year, had sustained significant damage in that engagement, and had been repaired and returned to service. Her commanding officer, Captain Tameichi Hara, was a professional of exceptional skill. The numbers support this, given that he was the only Japanese destroyer commander from the war's start still alive and in command at the war's end. When Rear Admiral Kimura transferred his flag to the Yahagi on the 23rd of February 1945, Kimura's first action was to request updated radar equipment from the Naval Ministry and the Kure Navy shipyard. The request was denied. The priority for the latest radar sets was suicide weapons, specifically the Kaiten human torpedoes, rather than conventional warships. The Yahagi went to sea on the 7th of April with old radar. She was dead in the water before noon. The Hamikaze's end happened fast. A bomb hit her aft deck, sending up a column of flame that Yoshida watched from the Yahagi's bridge, and then a torpedo or torpedoes broke her in 2. She was gone in minutes. Not the drawn-out flooding drama of the Yamato, but the sudden catastrophic failure of a much smaller ship, absorbing weapons designed for targets an order of magnitude larger. 100 of her crew died. 257 were rescued. The disproportion between the killing power directed at her and her size tells you something about how the American attack was organized. The strike aircraft were working through the escort screen systematically, and a destroyer that attracted their attention received the same weight of ordnance that would have been appropriate for a cruiser. The Hamikaze wasn't given a chance to be a small target. The Isokaze and the Kasumi deserve a specific mention because their ends were administered not by American aircraft, but by their own companions. Both ships were disabled during the engagement. The Isokaze by a near miss that destroyed her steering, the Kasumi by bomb hits that flooded her boiler room, and both were left drifting and incapable of navigation after the American aircraft departed. In each case, surviving crew members were transferred to other ships, and the disabled hull was then deliberately sunk to prevent capture and to end the uncertainty. The Isokaze was finished by gunfire from the Yukikaze. The Kasumi was sunk by torpedoes from the Fuyutsuki. These are the mercy killings of the operation. Necessary, professionally executed, entirely unremarkable to the men who carried them out, and almost entirely absent from popular accounts of the battle. The Pacific War produced hundreds of these moments. Ships that couldn't be saved and couldn't be left. Colleagues doing the final work. The Fuyutsuki had already had a complicated day before she administered the coup de grace to the Kasumi. She had sustained light damage from dud rocket hits during the air attack, rockets that struck the hull but failed to detonate, which is a specific category of good fortune that most accounts don't linger on. And her crew had then spent several hours in rescue operations, recovering survivors from the oil-covered water before conducting the Kasumi sinking at 16:57 hours. Her navigator, Lieutenant Nakata, had been wounded in both wrists by machine gun fire during the engagement. He was the man who recognized Yoshida when the Yahagi's surviving target designating officer was pulled over the side. Two Naval Academy classmates, one on the ship doing the rescuing, one among the rescued, meeting on a deck covered in oil and wounded men at the end of a battle that had killed most of the people they'd sailed with. The Pacific War kept producing these collisions of proximity. The Asashimo requires a separate paragraph because her loss was categorically different from the other ship's deaths. She had reported engine trouble at dawn on the 7th of April, 6:57 in the morning, before any American aircraft had appeared over the task force. She reported she could make 12 knots and would follow the main body. She fell progressively further behind as the morning advanced. At 12:10, she sent a signal reporting that she was under air attack. There were no further transmissions from her. All 330 men aboard died. The question that the available records do not answer, that I have looked for and cannot find a direct response to, is whether anyone in the task force's senior command seriously considered turning back to support her, or whether sending a destroyer back would have simply produced a second isolated ship being destroyed by American aircraft rather than one. The operational logic for continuing without her is clear enough. The human reality of watching a ship disappear astern and choosing not to turn back is something the operational logic doesn't address. The long-lance torpedo, the Type 93 24-inch weapon carried by all 8 destroyers of the task force, is perhaps the most striking unused capability in this entire story. It was arguably the finest surface-launched torpedo in the world in 1945, running on pure oxygen rather than compressed air, which eliminated the telltale white bubble trail that conventional torpedoes produced. Carrying a 490-kilogram warhead, capable of ranges up to 40,000 meters at 36 knots. Earlier in the war, it had been one of the most feared weapons in the Pacific, responsible for significant American losses in the night battles around Guadalcanal. On the 7th of April, 1945, not one long-lance torpedo was fired offensively by any Japanese destroyer in the task force. The operations planning had never envisioned a surface engagement. The destroyers were escort vessels for a ship that was going to beach herself, not attack platforms looking for American targets. Japan's most lethal surface weapon went to the bottom of the East China Sea unfired, on ships that never got to use what they carried. The casualty comparison that I find most clarifying about the scale of this operation is not the raw numbers, but the American side of the ledger. Task Force 58, which deployed approximately 387 aircraft across 3 strike waves, lost 10 aircraft and 12 aircrewmen, 12 men, in the destruction of 6 warships and the deaths of over 4,000 Japanese sailors. This is not a battle in the conventional sense of reciprocal violence between forces of comparable capability. It's closer to a controlled demolition. The American losses were real, and the men who died were real, and their deaths mattered to everyone who knew them. But the ratio, 4,242 Japanese dead to 12 American dead, is the number that defines what the battle actually was. It was the physical expression of what American industrial capacity, American carrier aviation doctrine, American signals intelligence, and 3.5 years of Pacific War experience had produced by April of 1945. The Japanese task force didn't lose a battle. They were processed. The 4 ships that made it back to Sasebo were repaired to varying degrees and served out the remaining months of the war in limited roles. The Yukikaze and the Hatsushimo were repaired within a week and returned to service. The Fuyutsuki took approximately 2 weeks. The Suzutsuki, with her destroyed bow, never rebuilt, remained at Sasebo until the war's end and was scrapped there. And there is something worth noting about the Yukikaze in particular, because her story extends beyond 1945 in a way that connects the operational narrative of the Yamato mission to the longer arc of Pacific War history. She survived the entire war without significant losses, 3 men killed from strafing at Yamato, and was subsequently ceded to the Republic of China Navy as war reparations, serving as the ROCS Danyang from 1947 until she was decommissioned and scrapped in Taiwan in 1970. The last surviving ship of the Yamato Task Force spent 23 years in the navy of a country that Japan had invaded. She outlasted every admiral who had ordered her mission, every strategic framework that had justified it, and the empire whose flag she had sailed under. She was scrapped in Taiwan in 1970. The East China Sea, 400 miles away, still holds the wreck of the ship she was sent to escort. Chapter 14. Tokyo watches the smoke. Admiral Soemu Toyoda was in Tokyo on the 7th of April 1945, when news of the Yamato's sinking reached Combined Fleet headquarters. He was not aboard any of the ships he had ordered to sea. This is worth stating plainly, not as accusation, but as simple fact. The man who issued the operational order for Ten Ichigo spent the day of its execution at a desk. The order had gone out. The ships had sailed. The intelligence had been intercepted and processed by the Americans before the task force even cleared the Bungo Strait. And now, sometime in the early afternoon of the 7th, the signals arrived. The operation cancelled. The Yamato lost. The force destroyed. Toyoda received the news without visible reaction, according to staff officers who were present. He called no emergency meeting. There was, in the most practical sense, nothing to discuss. The decision had been made. The decision had been executed. The results were what everyone who had thought carefully about the operation had expected the results to be. Toyoda's post-war interrogation by United States Strategic Bombing Survey officers is one of the most extraordinary documents produced by the Pacific War's accounting of itself. He was questioned in 1945, under occupation authority, by American naval analysts who had won the war he had been responsible for fighting. And he explained, with a directness that suggests either extraordinary personal honesty or the exhaustion that comes after total defeat, exactly why he had ordered the Yamato mission. His words, as recorded in the USSBS interrogation transcript, deserve to be read in full rather than summarized. He said, he would not consider that it would be possible for the operation to succeed. He said, but on the other hand, should we do nothing and let the soldiers on Okinawa die without even attempting to do something in their support? He felt that the Navy would have difficulty justifying its existence. This is not fanaticism. This is not the language of a man who believed in divine wind and imperial destiny. This is the language of a bureaucrat, a very senior bureaucrat with enormous responsibility, explaining why institutional survival logic overrode operational probability calculus. The Navy had to be seen to be trying. The cost of not trying was institutional humiliation. The cost of trying was 4,000 dead. He made the calculation. The Imperial General Headquarters War Diary entry for the 8th of April, 1945, the day after the battle, allocates approximately 3 sentences to the loss of the Yamato force, before moving on to discuss Kikusui No. 2 planning and the status of ground defenses on Okinawa. 3 sentences. The largest single-day loss in the history of the Imperial Japanese Navy. 6 warships, over 4,000 men, the flagship of the combined fleet, receives the documentary treatment of a minor administrative notation. This is not accident or oversight. This is how institutions process catastrophic failures that cannot be publicly acknowledged. The failure is noted in the minimum terms necessary for the record to be complete, and the record moves on to what is happening next. The war diary is not a place for grief. It is a planning document. The plan had to continue. The coordination, or rather the non-coordination, between the Yamato sortie and Kikusui No. 1 is an operational detail that the official records tend to present as a synchronized effort, but which, examined more closely, looks like two parallel operations sharing a calendar rather than a genuine integrated plan. Kikusui No. 1 launched on the 6th and 7th of April. Approximately 355 aircraft attacking American naval forces off Okinawa, sinking 3 destroyers and damaging numerous other vessels. The theoretical synergy was that American carrier aircraft would be split between the Yamato surface threat and the kamikaze air attack, reducing the defensive resources available to counter either. In practice, the Yamato force was still more than 300 nautical miles from Okinawa when it was destroyed on the 7th. It never arrived, never created the diversion, never forced any division of American defensive resources. The kamikaze operation and the surface operation ran in parallel and separately, connected only by timing rather than by any genuine tactical interdependence. The Yamato died without providing the diversion she was partly supposed to provide. There is a dimension of the Yamato's dispatch that the operational histories tend to minimize, and I think it requires direct statement. The mission was, in significant part, an institutional communication from the Navy to the Army. The rivalry between the Imperial Japanese Army and the Imperial Japanese Navy had been one of the most consistently destructive features of Japan's war, producing strategic incoherence from the earliest months of the Pacific conflict through to its final weeks. By April of 1945, the Army was defending Okinawa with approximately 110,000 soldiers and was sustaining enormous casualties. The Navy's ability to support that defense was negligible. It had no carriers with trained air groups, its fuel was nearly exhausted, and its surface fleet had been destroyed in successive engagements since Midway. The Yamato sortie was, among other things, a proof of sincerity delivered to an army that had been accusing the Navy of conserving resources at the Army's expense. The 3,055 dead aboard the Yamato were, among other things, evidence that the Navy was not holding back. Whether that evidence was worth the price is a question the Army and Navy staffs in Tokyo in April of 1945 were not equipped to answer honestly. The news of the Yamato's loss was managed with the same apparatus of official denial that the Japanese military had been applying to unwelcome information since Midway. An official communiqué released to the Japanese press stated that the Yamato task force had engaged in an honorable attack on enemy forces at Okinawa. The words sunk, destroyed, and failed did not appear. The scale of the loss, 4,200 dead, 6 ships gone, the Navy's most powerful surface combatant at the bottom of the East China Sea, was not communicated to the Japanese public. Most Japanese civilians did not learn what had actually happened until after the surrender in August of 1945. Some didn't learn the full dimensions of it for years after that, as the occupation-era press restrictions gave way gradually and the testimonies of survivors and the assessments of historians began to fill in what the official record had deliberately omitted. The gap between what happened and what the Japanese public was permitted to know in April of 1945 was not narrow. It was the width of an entire naval disaster. The explosion that ended the Yamato, the magazine detonation at approximately 14:22 on the 7th of April, was visible from southern Kyushu, approximately 200 miles away. The pillar of fire, estimated at 2,000 meters by the navigation officer on one of the surviving destroyers, and the mushroom smoke column, estimated at 6,000 meters, were visible on the horizon to civilians in the Kagoshima area, who understood in a general sense that something very large was burning and dying in the water to the south. Some of them knew, some learned later. A few, presumably, watched that distant pillar and understood what they were watching without being able to say so, because the censorship apparatus that surrounded the Yamato's final voyage extended backward in time as well as forward, suppressing even the possibility of public acknowledgement that the ship existed in the form it did, had gone where it went, and had ended as it ended. The smoke over the East China Sea was the most visible military event in Japan's immediate geography that day. It was also, officially, not happening. Toyoda's post-war memoir, published in Japan in 1950, presents the Yamato mission differently from his USSBS interrogation testimony. In the memoir, written for a Japanese audience in the first years of Reconstruction, he frames the operation as a genuine tactical gamble that might have succeeded under different conditions, specifically with adequate air cover. In the USSBS interrogation, conducted under occupation authority for American analysts, he says clearly that he did not consider it possible to succeed. These two accounts cannot both be accurate descriptions of his state of mind when he issued the order. The most straightforward interpretation is that the USSBS testimony, given to men who had won and to whom strategic self-deception was less useful, is closer to what Toyoda actually believed in March and April of 1945. The memoir, written for compatriots who were rebuilding national identity from the ruins of total defeat, reflects the more protective framing that surviving leaders apply to their decisions when writing for an audience that lost along with them. Both documents tell you something true. They just tell you true things about different things. The last operational act of the Yamato task force, before the surviving ships turned north and began the long, damaged run towards Sasebo, was the rescue operation. Vice Admiral Ito had signaled the cancellation of the mission and released surviving ships to attempt return. Admiral Toyoda, informed of the situation, concurred with the abort order and with the rescue of survivors. This concurrence matters because, as Lieutenant Yoshida notes in his account, the force had been designated a special attack, which in the logic of the operation meant the men were not expected to return. The decision to conduct rescue operations was therefore not automatic. It required a command decision to override the terminal framing of the mission's original design. That decision was made. Approximately 1,620 survivors were recovered across all the sunken ships. This is not a small number, and the decision to recover them, rather than treat the mission's suicide designation as operative to the end, is, among the decisions made during this operation, one of the few that doesn't require extended moral accounting to understand. What Okinawa became, in the weeks and months after the Yamato's destruction, is the final measure of what the operation accomplished. The island was defended by 110,000 Japanese soldiers and fell on the 22nd of June, 1945, after approximately 82 days of some of the most brutal fighting of the Pacific War. The American cost was 12,000 killed and approximately 36,000 wounded. The Japanese military dead exceeded 100,000. The Okinawan civilian dead are estimated at between 90,000 and 120,000. The range itself a testament to the difficulty of accounting for civilian deaths in a war that consumed the landscape. The Yamato arrived at the bottom of the East China Sea, more than 300 nautical miles from Okinawa, on the 7th of April. The island it was sent to defend fell on the 22nd of June. Toyoda's institutional communication to the army had been sent and received, and had changed the outcome not at all. Chapter 15. The Seabed Archive. At a depth of approximately 340 meters in the East China Sea, roughly 180 miles southwest of Kagoshima, the Yamato has been lying on the seabed since the afternoon of the 7th of April, 1945. The water above her is 340 meters of cold, dark, high-pressure seawater. At that depth, the ambient pressure is approximately 34 atmospheres, which is to say roughly 500 pounds per square inch, acting on every exposed surface. The hull steel, which was manufactured to tolerances and specifications that were the finest Japan's industrial capacity could produce in the late 1930s, has been corroding in that environment for more than 80 years. The corrosion rate in deep cold water is significantly slower than in shallow coastal environments. The cold inhibits biological processes, the darkness limits photosynthetic activity, the depth reduces the oxygen saturation that accelerates oxidation. The ship is deteriorating, but it is deteriorating slowly, which means it is still there. And what is still there constitutes a primary source of a kind that no document archive can replicate. The first significant underwater survey of the Yamato wreck took place in 1985. The expedition confirmed what the post-war strategic analysis and the survivor accounts had established in their broad outlines. The ship lay in two main sections, separated at a point corresponding to the forward magazine area, with a large debris field surrounding both pieces. The bow to midship section is approximately 560 feet long. The stern section is approximately 264 feet. The gap between them, the space created by the detonation of the number 1 main battery magazine, is filled with scattered steel, debris, and sediment that has been accumulating for 8 decades. Subsequent surveys in 1999 and in more recent years using remotely operated vehicles with improved camera and sonar systems have progressively refined this picture, documenting specific structural features, identifying impact signatures in the hull plating, and recording the personal artifacts that have survived on the seabed alongside the military hardware. The break pattern in the hull is the most forensically significant feature of the wreck, and it says something about the ship's death that survivor accounts alone could not establish with certainty. The steel plating in the forward magazine area shows outward displacement. The metal has been pushed away from the source of the explosion, rather than inward toward it. This is the signature of an internal detonation, rather than an external impact. Torpedo damage produces inward deformation. The weapon explodes outside the hull and drives steel inward. Magazine detonation produces outward deformation. The explosion originates within the hull and drives steel outward. The wreck's break pattern confirms the survivor and post-war analytical accounts that the final catastrophic destruction of the Yamato came from the detonation of her own ammunition stores, rather than from the last torpedo that hit her. She was not broken by the enemy. She was broken by herself, by the 1,080 remaining propellant charges and the shell inventory that went up when the magazine temperature alarms were already screaming and the pumps to flood and cool the compartment were no longer working. The 3 main battery turrets lie inverted near the main hull sections. Each of them weighs approximately 2,774 tons, and each of them rests upside down on the seabed, a position that reflects the physics of the capsize exactly. As the ship rolled past 90 degrees, the turret's rotating structures, which were mounted on bearings that allowed them to train around a fixed barbette, separated from the ship under the combined forces of gravity and the momentum of the capsize. A turret weighing nearly 3,000 tons, mounted on a rotating bearing designed for training in normal operational conditions, rather than for surviving an inverted capsize, would have parted from its mounting at some point between approximately 90 and 120 degrees of roll. The turrets then fell independently of the hull, impacting the seabed in their inverted positions. They rest there now, the barrels of the 46-centimeter guns pointing down into the mud, the armored faces that once looked out toward enemy battle lines now facing the seabed. There is something in that image, the guns aimed at the bottom of the sea, that resists comfortable interpretation. The debris field covering 3 to 4 square kilometers around the 2 main hull sections contains both military objects and personal ones, and the personal ones are the more affecting. Survey footage has documented sake cups, the distinctive ceramic vessels used for the ritual drinking that marked every formal occasion in Japanese military and naval culture. Toolboxes, shoes, fabric remnants, and, documented in multiple survey accounts, china plates from the officers' mess, bearing the Imperial Navy chrysanthemum crest, lying in the silt at 340 meters depth with the kind of structural integrity that ceramic objects achieve when they're not shattered on impact. These plates have been at the bottom of the East China Sea since 1422, on the 7th of April, 1945. They are the same category of object, not the same objects, different occasions, different people, as the sake cups distributed to the 100 senior workers at Yamato's night launch ceremony in August of 1940. The ceramic survives what the steel cannot fully withstand. The seabed preserves what the war consumed. The Japanese government has designated the Yamato wreck a war grave under Japanese law, which formally prohibits the removal of objects from the site. This designation reflects an entirely reasonable position. The wreck contains the remains, in the form of personal effects and, presumably, human biological material, of approximately 3,000 men. Treating it as a museum or a salvage site, rather than a burial ground, requires a framework of historical and commercial interest that most people who think about it for more than a moment would find uncomfortable. The enforcement capacity of the relevant Japanese agencies at 340 meters depth in international waters is, however, essentially theoretical. The wreck is not easily accessible. The depth requires either research submersibles or sophisticated remotely operated vehicles, both of which are expensive and technically demanding. But as ROV technology becomes progressively cheaper and more capable, the barrier between designation and enforcement becomes more significant. As of early 2026, there have been allegations of unauthorized visits to the site. What has or hasn't been removed is not publicly established. The physics of what the magazine explosion did to the surrounding water, and therefore to the men in it, can be approximated from the observed blast dimensions. A pillar of fire reaching 2,000 meters and a smoke column reaching 6,000 meters represent an energy release of considerable magnitude. Post-war Japanese estimates suggested an equivalent of between 3,000 and 4,500 tons of TNT, though these figures are approximations made from visual observation at distance and should be treated as order of magnitude rather than precise calculations. What the blast pressure did in the water, where shock waves propagate far more efficiently than in air, traveling outward at roughly 1,500 meters per second, rather than the roughly 340 meters per second of an atmospheric shock wave, can be inferred from the survivor accounts. Men in the water at distances of hundreds of meters from the detonation point describe being thrown, disoriented, temporarily incapacitated. Men closer than that did not survive to describe anything. The wreck survey cannot document this directly, but the debris scatter pattern, objects found at the edges of the 3 to 4 square kilometer field, is consistent with an explosive event of the magnitude the survivor accounts describe. What the 1985 survey found in the Yamato's boiler rooms and machinery spaces, partially documented in subsequent reporting on the expedition, was the physical record of the counter-flooding operations that had been the ship's last survival measure. The starboard engine room flooding, which had temporarily corrected the developing port list in the middle stages of the battle, at the cost of drowning the men trapped in those spaces, left a physical signature in the machinery. Valves in positions consistent with deliberate opening rather than battle damage. Flooding patterns consistent with controlled rather than uncontrolled inflow. The machinery tells the story of what the damage control team did, in terms that are more precise than memory. The men who made those decisions are dead. The equipment that executed those decisions is still there, corroding slowly at 340 meters, carrying in its physical state the record of the last hour of a ship's life. I want to say something about the china plates. because I've been thinking about them since I first encountered the survey footage description. The officer's mess of a Japanese warship in 1945 was a specific social space with specific material culture. White gloves for formal dinners, ceramic tableware with the Navy crest, sake for ceremonies, the whole apparatus of institutional ritual that military organizations use to maintain identity and cohesion under pressure. On the morning of the 7th of April, 1945, the officers of the Yamato ate breakfast from those plates, or from plates exactly like them. Rice balls at battle stations, by most accounts. Not a formal meal, not the kind of occasion that brought out the good china. But the plates were there, in the mess, waiting for the next occasion that wasn't going to come. They went to the bottom at 1422. They've been there ever since. The chrysanthemum crest on the ceramic is, at 340 meters, still the chrysanthemum of the Imperial Japanese Navy, an institution that ceased to exist in August of 1945, whose flag was hauled down, whose name was changed, whose history was processed through occupation-era censorship and post-war revision and documentary film and memorial ceremony. The crest on the plates at the bottom of the East China Sea is the most unrevised version of that history that currently exists. The question of what should happen to the Yamato wreck, whether it should be left entirely undisturbed, whether limited archaeological survey should be permitted, whether any form of access beyond passive observation is appropriate, is not a question that has been resolved. The UNESCO Convention on the Protection of the Underwater Cultural Heritage, adopted in 2001, provides a framework for the protection of underwater sites of historical significance, including war graves. Japan has not formally ratified this convention. The legal position of the wreck, sitting in international waters beyond Japan's exclusive economic zone, is therefore governed by a patchwork of Japanese domestic law, international maritime law, and the practical constraint that nobody can easily get there, and the site is too deep for casual visitation. This ambiguity will not persist indefinitely. The technology to access 340-meter sites is becoming progressively cheaper and more widespread. Within the professional lifetimes of people currently studying marine archaeology, the Yamato wreck will be accessible to actors who are not bound by any of the legal frameworks currently nominally protecting it. What happens then is a question about values rather than law. It is also, already, overdue. Chapter 16. Japan after Yamato. The fall of Okinawa on the 22nd of June 1945 was not the end of anything except Okinawa's resistance. The island that the Yamato had been sent to defend, that the 4,242 dead of the Surface Special Attack Force had died in a gesture of support for, was in American hands. The 110,000 Japanese soldiers who had defended it were dead. The American cost of taking it was 12,000 killed and approximately 36,000 wounded in approximately 82 days of combat. These numbers are so large that they function in historical writing primarily as arguments rather than as descriptions of actual human experience, each figure representing a specific person who had arrived somewhere in the Pacific in the preceding years and did not leave it the same way they'd arrived. The numbers argue, compellingly, that Okinawa was among the most costly military operations of the entire Pacific War. They argue less compellingly for any particular conclusion about whether any of it was necessary, or whether different decisions by different people might have produced different outcomes. Military history is full of counterfactuals that nobody can close. The strategic irrelevance of the Yamato's sinking to the war's actual trajectory is worth stating with some precision, because the popular narrative of the battle sometimes implies a significance that the operational record doesn't support. In terms of American Pacific War planning, specifically the planning for Operations Olympic and Coronet, the proposed invasions of Kyushu in November of 1945 and Honshu in March of 1946, the loss of the Yamato changed nothing. The planning assumptions, the force allocations, the casualty estimates, The logistical calculations for both operations were based on a Japanese defensive capacity that had ceased to include the Yamato as a meaningful factor long before April of 1945. The ship was a symbol of naval power. Her removal from the board removed a symbol. It removed precisely nothing from the practical defensive resources the Japanese military could apply to the defense of the home islands. What the Yamato's destruction did affect, and this is where the operational consequence of the battle was most direct, was the institutional conclusion that the IJN drew from it. The lesson was not that surface ships couldn't survive air attack without air cover, though that lesson was available and thoroughly proven. The lesson that appears in the planning documents and operational decisions of the following months was something narrower and, in retrospect, grimmer. That surface ships were too slow, too visible, too expensive in material and fuel terms, and that the resources previously allocated to maintaining surface warships should be redirected toward the kamikaze program, which was consuming aircraft and pilots at a rate that even Japan's depleted aviation industry could potentially sustain for some months more. The pace of Kikusui operations accelerated through May and June of 1945. 10 major Kikusui waves were launched between April and June. Approximately 1,900 sorties were flown. The strategic calculation had shifted entirely to attrition through suicide, the hope being not to defeat the American fleet, but to make the cost of invasion so high that American public opinion would force a negotiated peace before the home islands were touched. This is the part of the Yamato story that connects most directly to the atomic bomb, and it requires careful handling to avoid the retrospective certainty that the available evidence doesn't actually support. The Japanese military's commitment to a defense by attrition strategy, fight to the last, in the operational planning language of the period, was based on specific casualty estimates for the projected American invasion. Those estimates suggested that inflicting sufficient American casualties on the Kyushu beaches might produce a negotiated settlement before the main Honshu invasion. The American casualty projections being generated simultaneously on the other side of the war were producing numbers that informed the decision-making around the atomic bomb. Whether the Yamato's sortie and its demonstration of continued Japanese willingness to absorb catastrophic losses in a militarily futile gesture influenced American thinking about the likely cost of invasion is not cleanly documented. What can be said is that the pattern, Japanese forces fighting to effective destruction rather than surrender, at every level from individual soldiers to the nation's largest warship, was part of the evidence that American planners were reading when they made the decisions they made in July and August of 1945. The cultural mythology around the Yamato began essentially immediately, not after the war, not after a period of historical reflection, but within weeks of the sinking. In the internal communications of the Naval General Staff, and in the informal conversations among surviving officers that post-war testimonies document, the framing of the mission as an expression of Yamato Damashi, the spirit of Japan, the soul of the ancient homeland, was established before the summer of 1945. This framing was not entirely cynical. The men who applied it had genuinely lost friends, colleagues, and subordinates. Their need to find meaning in that loss was real and human. But the mythology also served a function that was less purely personal. It converted a catastrophic operational failure into a spiritual achievement, transforming the question from, was this a competent use of military resources, to which the answer was clearly no, to, did these men die with honor, to which the answer could be yes without contradiction. The mythology wasn't a lie. It was a reframing that made a different question easier to answer. Lieutenant Yoshida's memoir, published 62 years after the battle, holds both the mythology and the analytical clarity in permanent, unresolved tension. He writes that he believes the operation was a worthy end for the Yamato, a manifestation of the Bushido warrior spirit. He also writes that the moment Japan entered the war in December of 1941, The tragic fate of the Okinawa Special Attack Surface Force was established. He doesn't experience these two statements as contradictory. He holds them simultaneously as the long view of a man who was 23 years old on the 7th of April, 1945, and was 83 when he wrote about it, and had spent 60 years finding a way to carry both truths at once. This is not a failure of historical clarity. This is what surviving something correctly predicted and genuinely terrible actually looks like when someone is honest about it over a long period of time. The half-built super battleship that never received a name, hull number 111, laid down at Yokosuka in 1940 and suspended, restarted, and finally scrapped on the slipway in 1942, represents the Yamato class's ultimate institutional epitaph. Japan began building a third ship of the class, found it couldn't sustain the construction program under wartime conditions, and scrapped her before she was finished. The steel was redirected. The Musashi, the second completed ship of the class, had been sunk in the Sibuyan Sea during the Battle of Leyte Gulf in October of 1944, absorbing 17 bomb hits and 19 torpedo strikes before going down, taking 1,023 of her crew with her. Paul Allen's expedition found her in the Philippines in 2015. And then the Yamato, 4 months and 6 months later respectively, both gone. The most powerful class of warships in human history produced exactly 2 operational ships, of which neither survived the war, and a third hull that was scrapped before it was named. The kamikaze operations that outlasted the Yamato, and in some organizational sense inherited her strategic logic, were not the improvised last resort of a desperate military. They were a formally developed, institutionally managed program that had been running since October of 1944, when the Special Attack Corps was formally established and began operations at Leyte Gulf. By the spring and summer of 1945, the program was the primary offensive weapon of the Japanese military in the Pacific. It was also, in the same institutional logic that had produced the Yamato sortie, a program that converted military men into projectiles rather than soldiers, weaponizing the willingness to die rather than the skill to fight. The Yamato, at 71,659 tons, was a kaiten at the scale of a national symbol. The kaiten itself, the human torpedo, a Type 93 long lance modified to carry a pilot who would guide it to target and die with it, was a Yamato at the scale of one man. The logic was identical at both ends of the size spectrum. The institution that built both things was operating from the same premise throughout. The question that Rear Admiral Morishita raised in his report to the Naval General Staff on the 16th of April, the report that argued explicitly that operations require favorable odds to be worth conducting, never received a formal institutional response that changed anything. The Kikusui operations continued. The kaiten program continued. The defense of Okinawa continued until there was nobody left to defend it. The Army and Navy staffs continued to plan the Ketsugo defensive operation for the home islands, projecting a ground battle of extraordinary violence if American forces landed on Kyushu. Everything continued in the institutional sense, with plans being made and resources being allocated and staff work being produced. The difference between before and after the Yamato was not that anything stopped. It was that after the Yamato, there was one less way to pretend that continuation was anything other than what it was. Chapter 17. The Name That Survived. There is a small destroyer currently serving in the Japan Maritime Self-Defense Force. She was commissioned in 2022. Her displacement is approximately 3,900 tons. She carries missile systems, a helicopter, and the full complement of sensors and weapons appropriate to a 21st century warship operating in the Western Pacific security environment. She is called the JS Yamato. She is the first Japanese warship to carry that name since the battleship of the same name went to the bottom of the East China Sea on the 7th of April, 1945. The naming was discussed in Japanese media when it was announced. Some saw it as appropriate historical honor. The name Yamato is, after all, the ancient poetic name for Japan itself, predating the battleship by more than 1,000 years. Others saw in it an uncomfortable rehabilitation of a specific kind of military symbolism. The Japan Maritime Self-Defense Force's stated justification was simply that Yamato refers to the Japanese homeland, not to the ship. This is literally true and simultaneously incomplete, in the way that many true statements about this particular history are simultaneously incomplete. The evening of the 3rd of April, 2006, approximately 61 years after the battle, a chartered cruise ship called the Fujimaru departed from Tokuyama, the same anchorage from which the Surface Special Attack Force had sailed in the afternoon of the 6th of April, 1945. Aboard her were 280 bereaved family members and surviving veterans of the 10 ships that had sailed from that place in 1945. Lieutenant Yoshida was among them. He was in his early 80s. The youngest survivor aboard was also more than 80 years old. It was described, before it began, as the final such memorial voyage. The generation with direct memory of the battle was reaching its end, and there would not be another gathering of this kind in any meaningful sense. They retraced the course. They held ceremonies at the sites where each ship had gone down. At the point where the Asashimo sank, participants cast bouquets into the sea while a traditional Japanese tune played. At the sites of the Yahagi and the Kasumi and the Hamakaze and the Isokaze, and last, the Yamato. At the site where the Yamato had gone down, at approximately 17:55 hours, in evening dusk, Yoshida stood at the rail and looked at the water. He doesn't say in his account what he thought during that moment. He describes the scene, the dusk, the swelling sea, the same weather as 61 years earlier, when he had floated in those same waters for several hours, waiting to die or be rescued. He says he was full of deep emotion. He doesn't specify the emotion, which I think is either very Japanese in its restraint or very human in its acknowledgement that the emotion in question doesn't have a name that a sentence can hold. He had been 23 years old and had survived a battle that killed most of the people around him. He was 83 years old and standing on a cruise ship looking at the place where it had happened. Between those two moments was the entire arc of a life spent with that specific knowledge in it. 60 years of Japanese reconstruction, of the JMSDF replacing the IJN, of the American occupation giving way to alliance, of the war being processed through memorial and film and academic history and public forgetting and private remembrance simultaneously. He had carried the 7th of April, 1945 through all of that. Now he was standing above it at sunset. What you feel in that moment, I don't think anyone who wasn't there can accurately specify. The 2005 Japanese film, directed by Junya Sato, presents the Yamato's story through a framing device. An elderly survivor, in the present day, is taken to the site of the sinking by a young woman connected to the crew's history. The film's account of the Yamato's final voyage is emotionally sincere and visually ambitious. It is also, in its structural choices, a meditation on the mythology rather than the history. The Yamato as an expression of Yamato Damashi, the crew as embodiments of selfless sacrifice, the mission framed in terms that emphasize spiritual coherence over operational critique. The film was commercially successful in Japan. It was critically mixed, with some reviewers praising its emotional commitment and others arguing that it aestheticized a catastrophic institutional failure in ways that served memorial purposes rather than historical ones. Both reactions were responding accurately to what the film actually does. It is a memorial film that uses historical events as its material. It is not dishonest about the events. It is selective about which questions to ask of them. Dr. Kunio Kotaki, the retired JMSDF captain who spoke at the 26th memorial ceremony on behalf of the bereaved families, is the son of Captain Hisao Kotaki, who commanded Destroyer Division 21 and died aboard the Asashimo on the 7th of April, 1945, when every man on that ship was lost. Kunio Kotaki never knew his father. He became a naval officer himself, served in the Maritime Self-Defense Force of the country that had replaced the navy his father had died serving, reached the rank of captain, and then retired and went to Tokuyama in 2006 to speak at a ceremony for the father he had never met. He spoke on behalf of the bereaved families, many of whom were also children who had never known the fathers or uncles or brothers who sailed from that anchorage in the spring of 1945. The ceremony concluded. Flowers were cast into the sea. The Fujimaru turned toward home. What Kotaki said in his private thoughts during that ceremony is not recorded and is not available to us. The archive ends before it reaches that room. The Nisei translator, Ensign Shigeo Yamada, born an American citizen, translating American submarine communications on the bridge of the Yahagi on the night of the 6th of April, 1945, belongs in this final reckoning because his story captures something about this battle that none of the other individual stories quite reaches. He was in the most literally divided position of anyone in the task force. An American citizen serving in the Imperial Japanese Navy, translating English radio transmissions for officers who were leading him toward his death. Doing his job with whatever combination of professional commitment and private resignation that situation required. He survived. His full account has never been translated into English. He appears in a single paragraph of the most authoritative American naval history of the battle. What he thought on the night of the 6th of April as he listened to American submarines discussing the ship he was standing on, what internal landscape that specific experience produced, is something the historical record does not contain and probably cannot recover. The 2024 Asahi Shimbun report suggesting that Hirohito's question may have been misinterpreted, that the Naval General Staff may have constructed an imperial mandate from a genuine inquiry, had not been definitively resolved in the scholarly literature as of early 2026. It sits at the edge of the established narrative as an unconfirmed revision that, if confirmed, would require rethinking the causal chain of the entire operation at its most fundamental level. The practical consequences of that revision, if it holds, would not be enormous for most of the story. The ships would still have sailed, the Americans would still have known they were coming, the battle would still have gone as it went. But the origins of the decision would look different. The question of who decided and on what basis, and with what understanding of what they were deciding, would have a different answer. History at this level of specificity is sometimes like that. Most of the architecture is fixed, and a single document revision changes not the building, but the explanation of why it was built where it is. Japan's ongoing conversation about its own military capacity, the conversation that produced the 2022 National Security Strategy, authorizing offensive strike capabilities for the first time since 1945, and the JMSDF destroyer bearing the Yamato's name commissioned that same year, takes place in a specific historical shadow. Not the shadow of the Yamato as a military lesson about the obsolescence of the battleship, though that lesson is real and demonstrable. The shadow is more specific. It is the question of what institutional and cultural mechanisms prevent military professionals from being overruled by political and symbolic imperatives when the professional judgment is correct and the symbolic imperative is catastrophically wrong. The captains in the Yahagi's wardroom on the 5th of April, 1945, gave a correct professional assessment. They were overruled. 4,242 men died. The institutional framework that produced that overruling. The structure in which an imperial question could be misinterpreted as a mandate, and a mandate could override collective expert judgment without formal mechanism for appeal, is the historical artifact that the Yamato story leaves behind more permanently than the ship itself. The 4,242 men who died on the 7th of April 1945 were not abstractions. They were men who had eaten breakfast, who had families in Kure and Yokosuka and Sasebo, and in farming villages in Kyushu and on islands in the inland sea, who had signed secrecy oaths at Kure, or trained at Etajima, or come up through the destroyer flotillas in 3 years of Pacific War combat. They were men who had been told, with varying degrees of directness depending on their rank and their ship, that they were going somewhere from which they were not expected to return. Some of them had made their peace with that. Some hadn't. Some of them, the 67 Etajima midshipmen sent ashore before departure, the 6 sailors removed from the roster, the men given shore leave in the final hours at Tokuyama, were specifically excluded from the dying by calculations that their surviving counterparts had made about whose death was worth what. These distinctions, too, are part of the record. What survives of the Yamato at 340 meters is not the ship. The ship was the living system, the men and the machine together, the boilers at operating temperature, and the guns trained, and the flag at the masthead, and the 34-foot wake crossing the inland sea. What survives is the hull, the turrets, the china plates, and the shoes. What survives in the documentary record is a specific combination of American decrypts and Japanese memoirs and post-war interrogations and memorial testimony and historiographical revision and a Asahi Shimbun report about a palace document whose implications haven't been fully absorbed yet. What survives in the cultural memory is a name, the ancient name of Japan itself, given to a ship, given now to a destroyer that weighs 1/18 as much and carries weapons the original ship never imagined. The name moves through time, accumulating meanings it wasn't originally given. Yamato, Japan, the ship, the spirit, the disaster. The argument about what happened and why, and what it meant, and what it still means. None of these are settled. None of them should be. The East China Sea on the evening of the 3rd of April, 2006, as the Fujimaru turned away from the place where the Yamato went down, carrying the last survivors and the families of the dead, toward home through the same dusk that Lieutenant Yoshida had described as identical to the dusk 61 years earlier, when he had floated in that water. The sea doesn't look like anything in particular. It looks like water. 340 meters below the surface, where the Fujimaru was sailing, the 2 hull sections of the Yamato were sitting in the dark, in the cold, in 34 atmospheres of pressure, corroding slowly. The turrets were upside down in the silt. The chrysanthemum plates were in the debris field. The shoes were there. The toolboxes were there. The records of the damage control team's last decisions were written in the positions of the flood valves in the starboard engine room. All of it was there, and all of it was dark, and nobody was watching it. Yoshida stood at the rail until the light was gone. Then he went below.